Germany after World War I wasn't just defeated, it was disoriented. Streets were full of veterans with nowhere to go, families counting coins that no longer mattered, and a country asking the same bitter question: how did we fall this far? In that atmosphere of fear and humiliation, a fiery politician named Adolf Hitler began to rise, and around him, almost unnoticed, a small shield of loyal men took shape. They weren't an army, not yet, just a personal guard in matching uniforms, silent at the edge of rallies, watching the crowd more than the stage. They called themselves the Schutzstaffel, the SS. Few people paid attention to them in those early days, but history is full of movements that start as shadows, and sometimes the quietest shadows are the ones that grow into something monstrous. Over the next 20 years, the SS became something the modern world had never seen. An organization that fused soldiers, police, intelligence officers, and clerks into one machine. It built an empire inside a nation with its own rules, its own armies, and its own prisons. It helped start wars, reshape conquered lands, and carry out the Holocaust with a chilling efficiency. And it did all of this not in a frenzy, but in an orderly, paperwork-stamped calm. If you were raised in an America that remembers the photographs from 1945, the striped uniforms, the barbed wire, the stunned faces of liberators, then you've already met the SS in its final form. But to understand how that darkness was made, we have to follow the story from the beginning, from bodyguards to battlefield elites, from secret police to the architects of genocide, and finally to a collapse that left the world asking how ordinary men became instruments of unimaginable cruelty. Settle in with me. This is Lullaby of Empires, and tonight's tale is the entire story of the SS, a nation in ruins, 1918, 1923. Germany did not wake up one morning and decide to follow the path that would lead to the SS. History rarely works like that. It moves more quietly, like a river, changing its course grain by grain, until one day the landscape is different, and no one can quite say when it happened. To understand the birth of the SS, we have to begin long before black uniforms and runes, before Himmler and the camps, before the machinery of fear became a system. We have to begin in a country that felt as if it had been broken open, its pride shattered, its economy trembling, its people hungry for certainty. In November of 1918, the First World War ended, and Germany was left standing in the cold, staring at what it had lost. The war had drained the empire of its young men and its wealth. 4 years of trench warfare had carved a scar across Europe and across the German mind. The Kaiser abdicated. The monarchy collapsed. What replaced it was not victory or glory, but an unsure republic born in exhaustion. The streets of Berlin and Munich filled with returning soldiers who had survived the front only to find their nation unrecognizable. Many of them came home to unemployment, to shortages, to families that had learned to live without them and could barely afford to live at all. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 made the wound deeper. Germany was held responsible for the war and forced to accept crushing reparations. It lost territory, colonies, and the right to maintain a large military. To many Germans, Versailles felt less like a peace treaty and more like a humiliation ritual written into law. The loss was not only material, it was psychological. A country that had once believed itself a great power now felt shackled, watched, and punished. It is difficult to overstate how much that sense of shame mattered. A nation can survive poverty, but humiliation has a way of fermenting into something darker: resentment that waits patiently for a voice. And Germany in those years had many voices, none of them agreeing on a way forward. The new Weimar Republic was democratic in structure, but fragile in spirit. It was pulled in every direction at once, by socialists and communists who wanted revolution, by conservatives who wanted the old order restored, by nationalists who wanted revenge, and by ordinary people who wanted bread and stability. In cities, street politics became physical. Paramilitary groups formed like weeds between paving stones. Veterans joined militias not because they were violent by nature, but because war had trained them to belong to something disciplined, and peace had offered nothing to replace it. Munich, in particular, became a kind of pressure cooker. Bavaria had long carried a separate identity from Berlin, more conservative, more suspicious of the Republic. The city was full of armed groups and political clubs that met in beer halls thick with smoke and arguments. It was a place where anger had room to perform. Here, the story of the Nazi movement began to gather shape, not as an empire yet, but as a mood, an emotional atmosphere in which defeat felt intolerable and restoration felt urgent. The early 1922 brought another blow: hyperinflation. Reparations, war debts, and political instability combined into an economic nightmare. The German mark collapsed so quickly that prices doubled within days, sometimes within hours. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark in the morning might cost 5 by evening. Savings evaporated. People carried money in wheelbarrows to buy necessities, only to find that the money was worthless by the time they reached the shop. Elderly couples who had saved their entire lives watched their security dissolve like sugar in water. Middle-class families were pushed into desperation. When economies collapse like that, trust collapses with them. The state looks powerless, and people stop believing that ordinary rules can protect them. This is the kind of environment where extreme movements flourish, not because everyone suddenly becomes cruel, but because everyone becomes frightened. In fear, people crave simplicity. They want their suffering to have a cause and their future to have a plan. They want someone to say, "This is why it happened. This is who to blame. This is how we fix it." Germany was full of such hunger. The question was, which voice would satisfy it first? Among the thousands of angry men speaking in Munich's taverns was a former corporal named Adolf Hitler. At this stage, he was not a dictator, and not yet even famous. He was a veteran who had found in politics a replacement for the battlefield's clarity. He joined a small nationalist party, the German Workers' Party, and discovered that he had a talent for speaking to resentment. His speeches were not sophisticated. They were rhythmic, repetitive, and emotionally direct. He spoke of betrayal, of enemies within, of a Germany robbed of its rightful greatness. To audiences drifting between despair and rage, his certainty felt like oxygen. Hitler's early followers were not the elite. Many were veterans, unemployed workers, disillusioned students, and men who felt the Republic had failed them. Their grievance was a glue. They wanted a leader who did not apologize for their bitterness, but turned it into pride. And so, in smoky beer halls, a movement began to grow. But movements are always vulnerable at the beginning. They have enemies on the streets and rivals within. Violence was common in Munich politics, and Hitler learned quickly that speeches without muscle could be drowned out. The Nazi movement created its own paramilitary force, the Sturmabteilung, or SA, the stormtroopers, known for their brown shirts. The SA were loud, aggressive, and built for street intimidation. They broke up political meetings, fought communists in alleys, and protected Nazi gatherings with fists and clubs. In those years, the SA were the public face of Nazi power. Chaotic, brutal, theatrical, yet even early on, Hitler wanted something different beside him. The SA were useful, but they were not trustworthy in the way a future dictator needs. They were too numerous, too impulsive, too tied to their own street authority. Hitler wanted a small inner ring that would be personally loyal men who protected not the party in general, but him specifically. A quiet guard, not a street army. This desire would matter later. The impulse for a personal shield, separate from ordinary allegiance, planted a seed that would grow into the SS. But in these early years, it was only a seed. The first attempt by Hitler to seize power came in 1923, in the event known as the Beer Hall Putsch. By then, Germany was at peak instability. French and Belgian troops had occupied the Ruhr in response to missed reparations payments. The Weimar government called for passive resistance, which only worsened inflation. Political violence surged. Bavaria was particularly turbulent, and a mixture of nationalist groups believed a coup could succeed. Hitler and his followers tried to imitate Mussolini's march on Rome. They stormed a beer hall where Bavarian leaders were speaking, declared a national revolution, and planned to march on Berlin. It was dramatic, it was reckless, and it failed. The march the next day ended in confusion and gunfire. Police fired on the Nazis in the streets. 16 Nazis were killed. Hitler fled, was arrested, and put on trial for treason. The putsch collapse was humiliating for the Nazis, but it was also strangely useful. Hitler used the trial as a platform, turning the courtroom into a stage. Newspapers across Germany carried his words. He spoke as a patriot, betrayed by an illegitimate republic. The judges, sympathetic to nationalist sentiment, treated him lightly. He was sentenced to prison but served only about 9 months. In prison, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, a book that laid out his ideology. Nationalism fused with racial hatred. Anti-Semitism presented as a political explanation for Germany's collapse, and a vision of expansion eastward. At the time, many Germans dismissed it as the rambling bitterness of a fanatic. But ideology has a way of waiting for its moment. The book did not create Hitler's power on its own, yet it gave structure to a movement that was learning to be patient. When he was released in 1924, Hitler decided to pursue power legally, through elections and propaganda, rather than through another premature coup. This shift was crucial. It meant the Nazi movement began to build itself with long-term intent, organization, discipline, image, and loyalty. The SA remained important as muscle, but Hitler wanted better control. He wanted a movement that could look like order, not just anger. And he wanted those closest to him to be obedient in a way that was almost religious. This is the atmosphere we must hold in mind. A nation humiliated and frightened, a democracy unsure of its own authority, a culture soaked in resentment, and a political movement gathering strength by promising mythic restoration. It was not inevitable that the SS would arise, but the conditions that made it possible were already in place. Germany between 1918 and 1923 was a place where contradictions lived side by side. There was genuine cultural brilliance, Berlin's art scene, new cinema, groundbreaking, science. And there was misery at street level, hunger, unemployment, fear of communist uprising, fear of nationalist revenge. Many people wanted simply to rebuild their lives, but rebuilding is hard when the ground feels unstable. In that uncertainty, promises of certainty become powerful. Political parties argued in parliament, while men fought outside it. Every crisis, economic, diplomatic, social, made the republic look weaker. And each time it looked weaker, more people drifted toward movements that promised strength without the mess of debate. The Nazis were not yet the dominant force. They were one of many extremist groups competing for attention. But they were learning something vital, that fear can be organized, that humiliation can be weaponized, and that loyalty is easier to cultivate when people feel their world is falling apart. If you were sitting in Munich in 1922, listening to a veteran in a beer hall speak of betrayal, you might have nodded without imagining where such bitterness could lead. If you were a shopkeeper watching your savings vanish under hyperinflation, you might have been ready to believe that some hidden enemy had caused your suffering. If you were a young man without work, watching politicians bicker while your family went hungry, you might have found a strange comfort in uniforms, salutes, and the language of destiny. These are not excuses. They are the human roots of a political catastrophe, because that is how the SS begins, not with monsters, but with men shaped by collapse. The SS will later become an engine of terror, but its origins lie in a society searching for control. The cruelty comes later. The psychology begins here. So, as this chapter closes, imagine Germany in the winter of 1923. Streets dim, under economic despair, veterans restless, political factions armed, the Weimar Republic wobbling under crisis, and a small party in Munich learning that anger, if disciplined, can become power. Hitler is in prison, not yet a ruler, but already a symbol for those who feel cheated by history. The Nazi movement is battered but not broken. It is regrouping. It is becoming organized. It is preparing to return. And within that returning movement, a quieter idea is taking its first breath. The need for a personal guard whose loyalty is not to a nation, not to a law, but to a single man. In the ruins of a wounded Germany, that seed waits. It does not yet have a name that will terrify the world, but in a few years, it will. For now, the country is still deciding what it will become. And in that decision, the future SS is already hidden like a shadow in fog, faint at first, and growing, darker with every step. Hitler's inner circle, 1923, 1925. When Adolf Hitler walked out of Landsberg prison in December 1924, he was not returning to triumph. The beer hall putsch had failed, the Nazi Party had been temporarily banned, and much of its leadership had scattered. Yet prison did not weaken Hitler's belief. It sharpened it. Failure taught him two lessons he would never forget. Power had to be taken with patience, and loyalty had to be personal, not merely ideological. If he was to climb again, he needed a movement that looked disciplined from the outside and obedient on the inside. Germany in 1924 was still unstable, even after the worst of hyperinflation had eased. The new Rentenmark and the Dawes Plan brought a measure of economic relief, but relief is not the same as healing. Veterans remained adrift. Middle-class families feared another crash, and the Weimar Republic still felt to many like a fragile experiment imposed after defeat. Coalition governments rose and fell. Political street violence continued. Communists and nationalists treated one another as mortal enemies. In Bavaria, paramilitary culture had become almost normal, a substitute for national pride and a rehearsal for future conflict. The Republic survived, but it did so in a country where many people were quietly waiting for something stronger. Hitler's next move was a strategic pivot. The putsch had shown him that a loud militia cannot seize a state if the state still has guns and legitimacy. He decided the next path would be legal in appearance: elections, propaganda, and relentless organization. But legality required control. He needed to rebuild the Nazi Party as a machine, not a riot. And he needed to ensure that no one inside that machine could challenge him the way the putsch's chaos had nearly done. The Nazi movement already had muscle: the SA, or stormtroopers. They were the brown-shirted street fighters who guarded rallies, battled communist militias, and made the party look fearless. In the early years, the SA was the visible force that drew many young, angry men to the Nazis. But the SA was also unruly. It drank, brawled, and followed its own leaders as much as it followed Hitler. Ernst Röhm, its chief organizer, wanted mass revolution, not careful legality. Even in the mid-1922s, the SA's swelling size and appetite for action made it both an asset and a potential threat. Hitler knew that a movement depending only on street fighters could be captured by the street fighters. So Hitler began to cultivate a second, quieter kind of loyalty: the loyalty of proximity. He had always kept small personal guards near him at meetings, men who had stood with him through the putsch and proven their devotion more by temperament than by skill. They were not chosen because they were Germany's best soldiers. Plenty of veterans were tougher. They were chosen because they did not improvise, brag, or question. Their value was psychological, a willingness to surrender the self to a leader. They were to be a wall between Hitler and the outside world. Physical protection, yes, but also emotional and political insulation. This inner guard passed through different names. First, a staff guard. Later, the Bund, Stoßtrupp Hitler, but the principle stayed constant. They were few, measured in dozens, not hundreds. Their task was not to fight street battles. The SA did that. Their task was to protect the leader's body, image, and authority. That meant standing behind him in silence at rallies, controlling access to him, and projecting the idea that he already had a disciplined order that belonged to him alone. In politics, symbolism is a form of power. A man surrounded by loyal sentries looks like a man who is already important. Equally important was the oath culture Hitler fostered. The early Nazi party demanded loyalty, but Hitler demanded something more intimate. He did not want followers who could separate the movement from the man. He wanted a relationship that felt sacred. Membership in the Guard required swearing personal devotion to Hitler rather than to Germany or to any constitution. In a democracy still trying to teach itself the habits of civic loyalty, that was a radical step. It created a moral shortcut. Once a man binds himself to a person, duty becomes whatever that person says it is. The Guard was not just a job, it was a bond. Hitler also used discipline as a story about destiny. The Republic's politics were loud, messy, and divided, and he reflected that messiness back as proof of weakness. The Guard, by contrast, embodied the order he promised Germany. Their stillness on stage, their crisp formations, their refusal to mingle like ordinary men, these were deliberate choices. Hitler was already constructing a myth around himself, not just a politician, but a future destiny, surrounded by chosen protectors. For supporters hungry for stability, the sight was seductive. It suggested that chaos could be replaced by hierarchy, and that the Binste future could be commanded into existence. In 1925, Hitler formally recreated the Schutzstaffel, the SS, as a small protection squad within the SA structure. At this moment, the SS was not an independent empire, not even close. It was officially a subsection of the SA, meant to serve as the Führer's personal guard and a more reliable unit at rallies. Its early size was tiny, perhaps only a few hundred by year's end. Its early rules emphasized conduct and loyalty. Applicants were expected to be disciplined, sober, and absolutely dependable. The SS was presented as the cleaner, calmer brother of the SA, an inner circle of men who could be trusted to stand near Hitler without turning his movement into a drunken mob. What seemed like a simple bureaucratic step was really a shift in internal culture. SS men were encouraged to think of themselves as different from the SA. The JAR, SA was mass, swagger, and street power. The SS was select, quiet, and close. That difference produced pride, and pride produced separation. Even before the SS had power, it had identity. Identity is dangerous when it is built on being chosen. It makes obedience feel like honor, and it makes cruelty easier to justify as duty. Hitler encouraged that feeling because it served his long game. He did not want a personal guard that was simply better trained. He wanted one that was emotionally and socially dependent on him. The smaller the circle, the easier it is to bind through privilege. Being close to Hitler meant status, access, and the intoxicating sense of belonging to the party's real core. If the SA was the crowd, the SS was the inner rail. You stood there because you were trusted, and because you were trusted, you surrendered more of yourself. The SS thus began as a prize ladder for ambitious men who wanted meaning, status, and a clear line of devotion. A second function of the early SS was internal policing. The failed putsch had made Hitler cautious about infiltration and rivals. Bavaria was full of informers. The Nazi Party was still mocked in newspapers and watched by police. Hitler wanted more than bodyguards. He wanted guardians of loyalty, who could monitor who entered the movement, who stood near him, who might waver. Even in its infancy, the SS vetted meetings, controlled access to the Führer, and watched the party's own ranks for disobedience. This was not yet a state police force, but it was already practicing the mindset that would define it later: protection through surveillance. These roles mattered because they shaped the SS from the inside out. A guard that protects by monitoring is a guard that will eventually expand beyond the body to the society. A guard that prunes disloyalty inside a party is practicing for pruning disloyalty inside a nation. None of this was yet explicit policy, but the habit was forming. Habits are history's foundations. Once an organization learns that obedience and surveillance are its core virtues, it will seek larger arenas in which to practice those virtues. By the end of 1925, the SS still looked like a footnote to most Germans. The SA remained the movement's bruising engine. The Weimar Republic still sat on its constitutional foundations. Germany was even enjoying a brief cultural and economic upswing that would later be called the Golden Twenties. But beneath that calm, the Nazi Party was rebuilding with intent, and inside that party a private order had been born. The SS was tiny, but it already existed as a distinct idea, an elite of silence, personally loyal to Hitler, trained to equate discipline with virtue and proximity with destiny. Three threads were now fixed in place. First, the oath to the leader rather than to the state. This created a moral shortcut in which loyalty could cancel conscience. Second, the sense of an inner elite, apart from the masses. Separation bred superiority, and superiority would later breed brutality. Third, the use of ritualized discipline, uniformity, stillness, and selective membership to turn political service into identity. Once identity replaces judgment, violence can be reframed as obedience. Germany could not yet see where these threads would lead. The SS men themselves likely could not either. They were young, ambitious, and convinced they were serving order in a disordered world. That is how institutions of terror often begin, not with a clear plan for atrocity, but with a structure that rewards unthinking fidelity. So, we close this chapter with Hitler back on the stage, rebuilding legally, sharpening his propaganda, and pulling his movement into tighter formation. The SA marches loudly through the streets. The Republic tries to steady itself, and behind Hitler stands a narrow line of men who do not shout. They watch, they guard, they learn to be chosen. In their silence, the future SS is taking shape. Birth of the SS 1925, 1929. The Schutzstaffel did not begin as an empire. It began as a gesture, a small protective ring, standing behind a politician who believed history had chosen him. In 1925, when Hitler formally refounded the Nazi Party and rebuilt his personal guard into the SS, almost no one outside the movement paid much attention. Even inside the movement, the SS looked minor compared with the roaring mass of the SA. The brown shirts filled streets, and headlines. The black-clad future of the SS was still only a faint outline. Yet the most dangerous structures in history often begin quietly, not because their founders see the end clearly, but because they build habits that later become unstoppable. Germany in the mid-1920s had entered a brief period of relative calm. The hyperinflation crisis was over. Foreign loans under the Dawes Plan stabilized the economy. Factories hummed again, wages rose, and Berlin's cafes, theaters, and nightclubs glowed with a new cultural confidence. This was the Weimar Republic's most hopeful moment. But hope was unevenly distributed. Under the surface, scars remained. Veterans still carried resentment. Rural areas lagged behind the cities. Many conservatives regarded the Republic as illegitimate, something imposed by defeat. And in every household, memories of hunger, humiliation, and chaos had not vanished. They had merely quieted, waiting. Hitler understood that waiting could be a weapon. After prison, he aimed to take power through legality, elections, propaganda, public respectability. For that, he needed a movement that could look disciplined, stable, and inevitable. The SA could terrify opponents, but it could also embarrass the party with its street alcoholism and improvisation. Hitler wanted a smaller unit whose very style communicated something different: silence, precision, unblinking loyalty. The SS was built to be that style embodied. In these early years, the SS remained a subordinate branch inside the SA. Its tasks were practical and symbolic. Practically, it guarded Nazi rallies and protected Hitler from threats. Symbolically, it served as a living argument that the movement was not just a street brawl, but an order. SS men were chosen for temperament, before talent. They were expected to obey without chatter, to stand without swagger, to present themselves as men of self-control. They were trained to treat proximity to Hitler as privilege, and to treat privilege as responsibility. This alone was enough to set the SS apart from the SA. Separation creates identity. Identity creates destiny. As the SS took shape, its membership stayed small. Hitler wanted the Guard to feel exclusive. In a movement full of restless men, exclusivity is a powerful magnet. To be chosen into the SS meant you were seen. It meant you were closer to the center. It gave a man status no paycheck could buy. But status in such a system comes with a cost. The cost was surrender, of individuality, of doubt, of moral distance from the leader. The SS oath culture reinforced that surrender. Men swore personal loyalty to Hitler, not loyalty to a constitution or to Germany as a civic nation. The oath was a bridge over conscience. It simplified life into one rule: the Führer is the source of duty. This was not unique to Germany. History is full of guards who swear to kings. But in the Weimar context, where the state was trying to teach democratic loyalty to law, the personal oath was a quiet rebellion against modern citizenship. It created a private moral world within the party. To a man in the SS, legality meant something different than it meant to a man in parliament. A command from Hitler could outshine any statute. That psychological orientation mattered more than the Guard's size. A small group raised to believe personal obedience outranks law becomes a seedbed for tyranny. It teaches the habit of sacred command. Uniforms, too, began their slow evolution in these years. Early SS men wore much the same brown attire as the SA, but they marked themselves with black caps and specific insignia. Even before the legendary black uniform existed, the SS was learning that clothing could be a ritual. Distinctive symbols signal separation. Separation signals superiority. Superiority makes obedience feel noble. A man in a different cap is no longer just a supporter. He is a representative of order. When he stands behind Hitler on stage in silence, he does not seem like a follower. He seems like an extension of authority itself. The SS learned to perform discipline as theater, and in politics, theater becomes reality when repeated often enough. The SS also began to serve a second function: internal policing. The Nazi Party in the late 1922 was still a contested space. Rival factions argued over tactics. Opportunists drifted in and out. Police informers lurked. Hitler did not merely need protection from enemies outside. He needed protection from disunity within. SS men were trusted to control access to meetings, to watch for disloyalty. to function as the quiet enforcers of party conformity. Again, this was not yet a state terror apparatus, but it was already practicing a crucial mindset that security means the right to monitor and remove those who undermine the cause. Once an organization defines itself by guarding purity, it will always seek larger arenas to cleanse. By 1927 and 1928, the Nazi Party was still small nationally. In elections, it performed poorly. Many Germans viewed Hitler as a Bavarian curiosity, a loud man from failed coups. But organizations devoted to myth often grow strongest in quiet years. They refine doctrine, they codify hierarchy, they train habits. The SS used these years to drill its identity. Its leaders, still minor in the party, emphasized obedience, punctuality, and strict behavior. The SS was to be the reliable arm. Even small circles can gain influence when a larger movement fears its own chaos. The SA's unruliness made disciplined men seem essential. The SS began to look like the movement's conscience, cleaner, stricter, more ideal. That ideal was obviously constructed, but its effect was real. Among those shaping the SS now was Heinrich Himmler. In the mid-1922, he was not yet the architect of genocide. He was a young party organizer with a strange mix of administrative talent and ideological fanaticism. Himmler's personality mattered because it matched the SS's direction. Where the SA lived in noise and street power, Himmler lived in detail and record-keeping. He loved order. He loved lists. He believed discipline was spiritual. The SS offered a canvas for his temperament. He rose through the party by doing the kinds of things ambitious bureaucrats do well: organizing, documenting, managing logistics no one else wanted to handle. In a movement full of theatrical men, Himmler's quiet precision gave him leverage. Himmler viewed the SS not just as a bodyguard unit, but as a future elite. Even before he fully controlled it, he pushed the idea that membership should symbolize purity and dedication. He leaned into rituals and ancestry obsessions that were already present in Nazi ideology. He introduced the habit of asking who a man was by blood, not only by loyalty. This was still embryonic, more aspiration than system, but the direction was clear. Himmler wanted the SS to be a brotherhood apart, and once the SS accepted that role, it was destined to grow beyond guarding rallies. In 1929, Himmler was appointed Reichsführer SS, the leader of the organization. At that moment, the SS numbered only a few hundred men. It was still subordinate to the SA. Yet, Himmler's appointment marks the beginning of a crucial transformation. He was not a charismatic street commander. He was an obsessed builder. He began restructuring the SS with a vision of long-term autonomy. He tightened recruitment. He demanded higher standards of discipline. He cultivated secrecy and myth. He treated the SS like an order rather than a club. We should not imagine that SS recruits in these years were already thinking about mass murder. Most were young men who believed they were joining a disciplined elite defending Germany against humiliation and internal enemies. Their belief was vicious, but not yet industrial. The SS's early cruelty was more psychological than physical. It trained men to see loyalty as virtue and outsiders as threats. Yet, that training is exactly how such organizations prepare for future violence. Before you can kill without remorse, you must first learn to obey without thought. Before you can build a machinery of terror, you must first accept that purity is more important than compassion. The late 1922 provided the SS with another gift: crisis on the horizon. In 1929, the Wall Street crash struck the world economy. Germany, dependent on American loans, was hit hard. Businesses collapsed. Unemployment soared. The brief Weimar stability began to crack. As desperation returned, so did the mass hunger for certainty that Germany had experienced earlier in the decade. Extremist parties began rising again. And the Nazis, who had patiently rebuilt network by network, suddenly found themselves in fertile ground. This matters for the SS because organizations of discipline expand fastest in moments of fear. As the Nazi Party attracted more followers, it also attracted more internal turbulence. Hitler relied on the SA to dominate streets, but he relied on the SS to ensure the movement's core remained personally loyal. Himmler positioned the SS as the party's purified inner circle, the solution to chaos. In times of uncertainty, people cling to the institutions that are most certain about themselves. The SS was very certain. By the end of 1929, the SS had not yet separated itself legally from the SA, but it had separated itself psychologically. It had become a concept, a protective order defined by silence, exclusivity, ritual, and personal devotion to Hitler. It was no longer just a guard unit. It was becoming a moral identity, a club where a man could feel chosen in a world that made him feel irrelevant. That feeling is intoxicating. It binds tighter than fear alone. So, if we pause here, before the storm of the 1,930 seconds arrives, we see the SS as something still small but already shaped. Its founding years produced 4 lasting foundations: personal loyalty as sacred duty. The oath to Hitler cultivated devotion that outranked law, elite separation as identity, being chosen, created, superiority, and the readiness to act without hesitation. Discipline as performance, uniformity, ritual, and silence turned obedience into something noble and mythic. Security through surveillance. Even early internal policing trained the habit of watching and removing impurities. These foundations did not yet guarantee the SS's future crimes, but they made those crimes possible. The SS was a seed with a particular genetic code. When the political soil of Germany darkened again, that seed would not grow into a normal guard. It would grow into an empire. For now, though, it is still the late 1920 seconds. Germany is sliding back into crisis. Hitler is rebuilding with patience instead of coups. The SA is swelling in the streets. And behind Hitler stands a growing black-capped circle, quieter than the rest, watching, measuring, believing themselves different. Their numbers are still small, their authority still limited, but their habit is already set. In the lull before the storm, the SS has learned to be an order, and orders, once born, do not like to remain small for long. From guard to state weapon, 1,934. By 1930, the SS was still small, still officially subordinate to the SA, and still almost invisible to the wider public. Yet Germany itself was no longer calm. The Great Depression spread across Europe like a slow frost, freezing factories, breaking banks, and hollowing out faith in parliamentary compromise. Unemployment climbed into the millions. Families who had begun to trust the Weimar recovery found themselves back in breadlines. The center parties seemed powerless, trapped in arguments, while the country slid into panic. In that panic, people did not only want solutions, they wanted certainty. And certainty, as history keeps proving, is the easiest doorway through which extremists enter. Hitler's strategy after his release from prison had been to climb legally, but legality did not mean softness. The Nazi Party organized relentlessly, building local chapters in towns and neighborhoods, holding rallies that were half sermon and half threat. The SA marched through streets as proof that the party was alive, strong, and ready. Their violence against communists and liberals was not an accidental byproduct. It was a deliberate signal that the Nazis could restore order by being more ruthless than the chaos around them. But the SA's size and wildness also scared the conservatives and army officers Hitler needed. He required a force that looked like discipline, not a street brawl. He needed guardians who could operate in silence. Under Himmler, the SS was being prepared for exactly that role. He tightened standards, demanded strict behavior, and pushed the idea that SS service was not just a task, but an identity. Membership remained exclusive on purpose. In a country where millions felt discarded, exclusivity was a powerful lure. The SS offered the intoxicating message that you were not part of the desperate crowd. You were part of the chosen few. The oath to Hitler deepened that separation. A man who swore personal loyalty to the Führer stepped into a moral universe where the leader's will outweighed every other obligation. The SS was not designed to be large. It was designed to be reliable. Even the SS's public appearance began to shift. The black uniform that would later become iconic was still being refined, but Himmler already understood the theatrical power of distinction. The SS wore black caps, silver-trimmed insignia, and symbols that hinted at mystery and destiny. At rallies, they stood behind Hitler like a silent wall. The SA shouted and surged. The SS did not. Their stillness made them look controlling rather than chaotic. And that was exactly the point. Hitler wanted to appear revolutionary to the streets and respectable to the elites. The SA provided the roar. The SS provided the cold posture of inevitable rule. The elections of 1930 shook the Republic. The Nazis surged from fringe to major force. In July 1932, they became the largest party in the Reichstag. Germany was now ungovernable by ordinary means. Coalitions collapsed, emergency decrees multiplied, and many conservatives concluded that parliamentary democracy was finished. They believed Hitler could be boxed in and used as a tool to steady the state. That illusion opened the door. On the 30th of January 1933, President Hindenburg appointed Hitler Chancellor. The moment looked legal on paper. In reality, it was the beginning of a dictatorship built, step by step, with terror waiting just behind law. Within weeks, the Nazis moved to destroy every barrier to total rule. After the Reichstag fire in February, Hitler pushed through the Reichstag fire decree, suspending civil liberties and allowing mass arrests. Communists were hunted, their offices raided, their leaders imprisoned. The SS, still smaller than the SA, stepped into a new role, not just guarding meetings, but guarding the state by crushing its opponents. Their discipline made them useful in raids and interrogations. Their loyalty made them safer to trust than the impulsive SA. In the early months of 1933, the SS learned that power comes fastest when it is attached to police authority. In March 1933, the Enabling Act passed, giving Hitler power to rule without parliament. Law now flowed from the Führer, and the line between party and government dissolved. Himmler moved quickly. In Bavaria, he secured control over the political police, and by April, he had become head of the Munich police. That administrative foothold mattered more than any street march. It meant Himmler could arrest and imprison under the cover of legality. Soon after, his reach expanded across Germany as SS men slid into police headquarters and ministries, replacing older officials who were dismissed, intimidated, or quietly absorbed into the new order. The SS was becoming a bureaucratic weapon as well as an ideological one. The first concentration camp at Dachau opened in March 1933 near Munich. Officially, it was for protective custody, a place to hold political enemies who threatened stability. In practice, it was proof of concept for a new system of terror. Dachau was administered by the SS, and it established patterns that would later spread across Europe. Prisoners stripped of identity, forced into humiliating routines, punished at the whim of guards, broken by methodical cruelty presented as discipline. The SS learned there that suffering could be organized, and that an institution could dehumanize without needing to scream. At Dachau, Himmler and Camp Commandant Theodor Eicke also created a model for SS guard culture. Eicke drilled his men to treat prisoners as subhuman threats, not fellow Germans. He wrote regulations for punishments, inspections, and order, turning cruelty into routine. Out of his staff would grow the SS Totenkopfverbände, the Death's Head units, a separate corps devoted to camp administration. The lesson was chillingly simple. Terror could be standardized, taught, and improved like any other state skill. Dachau was not an accident. It was a blueprint. Meanwhile, the SA kept swelling. By 1934, it numbered in the millions, dwarfing the SS. Many SA men believed that after victory, there should be a second revolution against the old elites, industrialists, army officers, conservatives who had helped Hitler into office. Their leader, Ernst Röhm, wanted the SA to become the new national army, to merge the Reichswehr beneath his command. To Hitler, this was intolerable. He needed the traditional army for future wars, and he needed the elites to keep industry running. Röhm's ambition threatened both. The regime faced an internal fork: street, revolution, or controlled dictatorship. The SS understood this tension instinctively. In the struggle between SA mass power and SS inner loyalty, the SS had a clear advantage. It was built for obedience without question. Himmler and his deputy Reinhard Heydrich used the SD, the SS intelligence service, to compile dossiers on SA leaders, emphasizing scandals and constructing a narrative that Rome was plotting against Hitler. Truth mattered less than usefulness. In authoritarian politics, an accusation becomes real the second the leader chooses to act on it. By early summer 1934, the lists were ready, and the SS was ready to prove what its oath meant. The purge came in the last days of June 1934, remembered as the Night of the Long Knives. Hitler flew to Munich and personally arrested Röhm and other SA leaders at a hotel in Bad Wiessee. Across Germany, SS and police units struck simultaneously. SA commanders were shot in their homes, dragged from barracks, or executed in prison yards. Old political enemies were killed as well, swept into the same wave of blood. It was not a riot. It was a surgical massacre carried out by men trained to obey without hesitation. For the SS, the purge was baptism in blood. They were not killing strangers. They were killing comrades who had marched beside them for years. They killed because they were told to. They killed because loyalty demanded it. June 1934 completed the SS's psychological transformation. It proved to Hitler that this organization would do anything for him. It also burned away the last boundary between obedience and moral choice. After a man crosses such a line once, the line stops existing. A new normal is born. The consequences were immediate. The SA was broken and reduced to a ceremonial shadow. The army, relieved that Rome's threat was gone, swore allegiance to Hitler, and the SS was rewarded with autonomy. It became an independent organization answering directly to Hitler and Himmler. Himmler's influence exploded. He now controlled the SS, the police, and the expanding concentration camp system. Germany had acquired what would soon be a state within a state, an empire of uniforms, files, prisons, and fear, operating alongside traditional government but increasingly above it. The purge also reshaped the SS's inner moral universe. Every institution of terror requires a moment when its members cross a point of no return. For the SS, that moment was the killing of its own comrades. Surviving members later insisted they were instruments, not authors. But instrumenthood is a chosen identity. The Night of the Long Knives taught them that obedience was not passive, it was sacred. Doubt became betrayal. Conscience became weakness. Once this creed settled into the bone, the SS could be turned toward anything. By late 1934, the SS stood with new status and a new mission. It controlled the camps. It policed the nation. It gathered intelligence. It guarded Hitler not just from bullets, but from dissent and rivalry. The Guard had become a state weapon, and in the years ahead, That weapon would be turned outward first on Germany's own citizens, then on Europe, and finally on history itself. The SS builds a state within a state, 1934, 1938. After the Night of the Long Knives, the SS stepped out of the shadow of the SA and into the main architecture of Hitler's regime. It was no longer a side unit, no longer one militia among many. It had proven itself in blood, and in Nazi politics, that was the most convincing. Resume: June 1934 taught the SS that obedience wasn't merely expected, it was sacred. Killing former comrades on command burned away the last thin wall between loyalty and moral choice. What remained was a disciplined order that Hitler could trust with anything, and Himmler understood that. This was the moment to turn a bodyguard corps into a parallel government. His first move was simple and ruthless: fuse the SS with the police and intelligence systems of the Reich. In Bavaria, he already commanded the political police. Now he pushed outward, replacing regional forces with SS-trained men. The Gestapo, originally created under Göring, slid under SS authority. Then, in 1936, Himmler was formally appointed chief of the German police. That title mattered because it made something revolutionary look administrative. The police were no longer guardians of law in any neutral sense. They were ideological enforcers whose loyalty ran through Himmler to Hitler. The SS had not just gained influence, it had gained the state's legal spine. The transformation was outwardly tidy. Doors still opened at police stations, clerks still stamped documents, uniforms stayed crisp. But the Dayhof meaning of power changed completely. A citizen no longer had to be convicted of any crime to be seized. He could be preventively detained. A woman no longer had to break a law to be targeted. She only had to be labeled unreliable, undesirable, or dangerous to the health of the Volk. The SS turned ordinary instruments, identity cards, permits, residence records, employment files into levers of coercion. Surveillance became routine. The country learned to live inside invisible boundaries. A neighbor's whisper could become a police report. A joke could become a dossier. The terror didn't need to shout. It needed only to record. At the heart of this new system stood Reinhard Heydrich, Himmler's coldly intelligent deputy. Heydrich built the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, into the regime's intelligence brain. The SD was not only a secret police unit hunting declared enemies. It was a mapmaker of society. It listened in factories, churches, universities, cafes, and party offices. It collected rumor, gossip, discontent, and even the private moods of ordinary citizens. In Heydrich's hands, information became power without needing courtroom proof. His genius was bureaucratic cruelty: turn society into data, then punish deviations from the data. With security in hand, Himmler turned to the second pillar of his empire: racial engineering. The SS had always spoken about purity, but now purity became policy. The Race and Settlement Office Russia expanded rapidly. Anyone hoping to join the SS had to submit proof of Aryan ancestry, not the last generation, but stretching back to grandparents and beyond. Marriage became a controlled privilege. SS men needed approval to wed, and their fiancés were examined like candidates for state office. This was not a side obsession, it was structural. By regulating who could marry and reproduce inside its ranks, the SS aimed to become a self-renewing elite caste that would survive political shifts and outlive the movement itself. Think about the psychological trap this created. A man who married under SS approval wasn't just a husband. He was a participant in a project. His family carried prestige, and prestige in a dictatorship is not a gift, it's a leash. The order promised belonging, status, and a sense of destiny. In return, it took control of the most intimate parts of life. The SS was building not merely a police state, but a biological aristocracy. Himmler wanted his men to think of themselves as the seed of a future empire, not servants of a temporary regime. These years also saw the SS deepen its rituals and myths. Himmler restored Wilsberg Castle in Westphalia as a ceremonial heart for his Black Order. He filled it with runic insignia, pseudo-medieval furnishings, and initiation rites designed to make SS officers feel part of an ancient brotherhood. To outsiders, it looked like theatrical fantasy. To Himmler, it was psychological armor. He wanted his men to believe that SS service was not only political, but spiritual. Fear can command a man. Faith can bind him for life. When obedience becomes religion, doubt becomes heresy. At the same time, the concentration camp system quietly expanded. Dachau had been the prototype. Under Theodor, Eicke, now inspector of concentration camps, the SS standardized camp life into an official method. Guards were trained under a consistent doctrine. Prisoners were not citizens who had broken laws. They were enemies of the nation's bloodstream. Discipline was presented as mercy, brutality as cleansing. Camps multiplied: Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, Ravensbrück, and others. At first, they held political opponents, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, Roma, and those labeled asocial. In every case, the SS stripped prisoners of identity and replaced their humanity with numbers and categories. The key shift from 1934 to 1938 was not only how many camps existed, it was how normal the camps became to those outside them. Arrests happened without trials. People vanished after quiet visits from police. Newspapers framed camps as re-education centers. Employers dismissed. Workers after an SS file landed on a desk. Terror blended into routine life, which is the most frightening kind. The SS was teaching society a new arithmetic. Obedience equals safety. Curiosity equals danger. Once that equation is accepted, a dictatorship no longer needs constant violence. It needs only the expectation of violence. The SS also began carving out economic independence. Through front organizations and access to confiscated property, it accumulated wealth outside normal ministries. Prison labor was tested as a profit source. Early SS enterprises grew near camps, producing goods for the state and for SS benefit. At this stage, the profits were small compared to wartime exploitation that would come later, but the principle mattered. Financial autonomy makes an institution harder to restrain. The SS was becoming self-funding, self-policing, and increasingly self-justifying. It could expand without asking permission. Politically, the regime grew more confident as opposition was dismantled. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935, defining who was Jewish by ancestry and banning marriages or relations between Jews and Aryans, turned ideology into law. The SS had not written these laws alone, but it enforced them with obsessive zeal. Bureaucrats traced family trees. Police investigated marriages. Teachers pushed racial hierarchy as common sense. The SS watched over all of it like a guardian of classification. Once prejudice becomes paperwork, it stops feeling like hate to those who serve it. It feels like administration. By 1938, the SS had become embedded so deeply in German life that its power seemed ordinary to many citizens. Its officers occupied high police posts. Its intelligence reports guided policy. Its racial offices regulated family futures. Its camps swallowed anyone marked as an obstacle. Yet, perhaps the most important change was internal. SS men were trained to see the law not as a limit, but as material. If a rule protected someone, the SS called an enemy, the rule was rewritten or ignored. The organization lived above legality because legality now flowed from it. That year also revealed how far the SS could reach beyond Germany's borders. In March 1938, the Anschluss brought Austria into the Reich. SS units moved in behind the Wehrmacht to seize police stations, arrest opponents, and organize anti-Jewish humiliation. Jews were forced to scrub streets, while photographers recorded their degradation. The SS did not only conquer land, it exported method. What had been built quietly inside Germany could now be replicated in any territory Hitler absorbed. Then came Kristallnacht in November 1938. This coordinated pogrom against Jewish synagogues, homes, and businesses across Germany and Austria was presented as spontaneous public outrage. In truth, it was state-directed violence executed with SS and police collaboration. Thousands of Jews were arrested and sent to camps. Insurance payments for destroyed property were confiscated. Jewish economic life was targeted for systematic dismantling. Kristallnacht marked a turning point. Terror that had been mostly bureaucratic and selective now became openly violent and national. The SS learned something crucial. A society already trained to accept quiet repression would not resist when repression turned loud. By the end of 1938, the SS was the regime's core institution. It was not yet the mass army it would become during war, but its structure was complete. It commanded a police empire. It possessed an intelligence brain. It ran a racial bureaucracy. It administered a camp system. It was building its own economic base, and it was staffed by men conditioned to see themselves as a sacred elite rather than civil servants with moral limits. Their uniforms symbolized destiny. Their files created reality. Their camps enforced obedience. In only 4 years, the SS had transformed from a guard of a man into a government of fear. Germany, too, had been reshaped to fit that scaffolding. Citizens now lived in a nation where private and public life blurred, where ancestry could decide a future, where dissent could vanish without a trial, and where the state's most feared arm operated in near silence. The SS had built its empire before Europe was conquered, before the Great Wars began. When war came, it would not need to invent a system of terror. It would only need to enlarge the one already waiting an order prepared to turn ideology into destiny on a continental scale. The Waffen-SS and the Road to War, 1938, 1939. By the end of 1938, Germany looked outward like a nation gathering breath for something larger. The borders had shifted without major resistance. Austria had been absorbed. Sudetenland had been seized. The Reich had expanded, and every success reinforced the illusion that Hitler's will was a force of nature. Inside Germany, the SS stood at the center of this transformation. It controlled the police, the camps, vast intelligence systems, and the ever-tightening rules of racial life. Yet Himmler was not satisfied with being the regime's inner skeleton. He wanted a battlefield arm worthy of the myth he was building, a military SS that could rival the traditional army and carry the ideological banner into war. The SS had already flirted with military identity. Since the early 1932s it had maintained small armed formations, originally intended for guard duties and internal security. These units drilled like soldiers but were treated as something different. They were not meant to be a national army, but a party force, personally loyal to Hitler and ideologically tied to Himmler. After 1934, as SS autonomy grew, these formations expanded. They grew into 2 main pieces: the SS Verfügungstruppe, SSVT, meaning disposal troops, available for Hitler's use, and the Totenkopfverbände, Death's Head units, guarding the concentration camps. Both were militarized in style. One would fight wars, the other would police genocide. Together they were the blunt instruments of Himmler's empire. Himmler dreamed bigger than a handful of armed guards. He envisioned a parallel army built not on tradition, but on purification. The Wehrmacht, still steeped in old Prussian habits and loyalty to the state rather than a party, could be used for war, But could it be trusted for revolution? Himmler did not think so. The SS needed its own soldiers, trained to see war not simply as strategy, but as racial destiny. The future battlefield, in his mind, was not only a contest between nations. It was a cleansing ceremony for Europe. If the SS was to shape history, it could not remain merely behind desks and fences. This ambition created tension. The German army leadership resented the SS intruding into military territory. They saw it as a political militia, undisciplined in doctrine, reckless with ideological zeal. Himmler, for his part, mistrusted the army's professionalism, because professionalism implied neutrality. He wanted soldiers who believed, not because belief makes armies tactically better, but because belief makes them reliable, instruments of political will. Hitler balanced both forces with a gambler's instinct. He needed the army for expansion, but he also valued the SS as a loyal counterweight, so he allowed Himmler to expand the SSVT while keeping it officially subordinate to the Wehrmacht in wartime command. On paper, that compromise restrained Himmler. In reality, it gave the SS a doorway into war. Recruitment into the SSVT was framed as elite selection. Candidates underwent physical tests, ideological instruction, and ancestry scrutiny. They were told they were joining a brotherhood beyond ordinary. Soldiering. The SS uniform, already mythic within Germany, carried special glamour among young men searching for meaning amid propaganda. It promised discipline, heroism, and belonging. But there was another promise whispered beneath the rhetoric: freedom from moral hesitation. The SS soldier was not simply a defender of Germany, he was a defender of the Reich's ideological future. That subtle shift is the way armies become instruments of genocide without realizing it. When a soldier is taught that he fights for destiny rather than for law, his limits dissolve. By 1938, the SSVT numbered tens of thousands. They trained in separate barracks, under separate rituals, with separate symbols. Their officers were drawn from the SS hierarchy rather than the old Army Academy system. Their political education was not an extra class. It was the spine of training. Recruits learned the Nazi race narrative the way traditional soldiers learn drill. The Jews were cast not as neighbors, but as parasites. Bolshevism was cast not as a political system, but as a racial threat. Slavs were cast as inferior populations meant to be ruled. The language was consistent, repeated until it felt like common sense. Belief hardened into reflex. And reflex is what war relies on. The late 1932 also brought new opportunities for the SS to flex in public. When Germany marched into Austria, SS formations moved in alongside the Wehrmacht, securing police stations, arresting opponents, and orchestrating anti-Jewish terror. This was not just expansion of territory, it was a demonstration of method. Wherever the Reich went, the SS followed like a shadow, ready to reorganize society through fear and racial categories. Austria became the first rehearsal of imperial SS rule beyond Germany's 1,933 borders. The SS learned it could operate in occupied spaces with speed, confidence, and legal cover. It was a preview of what would soon happen across Europe. The Sudeten Crisis and Munich Agreement, later in 1938, further intoxicated the regime. Hitler had gained territory without a major war. His propaganda spun this as proof that destiny protects the bold. The SS, especially the SSVT, absorbed that mood deeply. Their officers framed expansion as vindication of ideology. Each success confirmed that the Reich's racial logic was not fantasy, but history in motion. The danger here was not simply overconfidence. It was moral inflation. Victory makes a movement feel justified. If the world yields, the movement assumes it was right all along. That feeling is how regimes cross from authoritarianism into catastrophe. Then came Kristallnacht, and the SS watched a different kind of victory. The pogrom showed that mass violence against Jews could be staged nationally, and the state could survive it. There were murmurs of discomfort among some Germans, but there was no meaningful resistance. The SS drew a lesson from that silence. If terror can be done in the open and still remain politically safe, then terror is not merely possible, it is strategic. Kristallnacht was not a battlefield event, yet it prepared SS men for battlefield thinking. The enemy can be crushed without consequences if the population is already conditioned to accept moral collapse. In that sense, the road to war ran straight through German streets. As 1939 approached, Hitler's ambitions sharpened. He wanted Poland, not only as territory, but as a first step toward his larger Eastern Empire. The army prepared for invasion. The SS prepared too, in a way different from the army. The Wehrmacht planned a campaign of speed and encirclement. The SSVT planned to prove itself worthy of myth. Its leaders pushed a cult of hardness. They told men that pity was weakness, that the future belonged to those who could carry out ruthless tasks without inner fracture. This was not psychological toughness in a neutral sense. It was the deliberate training of indifference to suffering. The SS soldier was being prepared not just to fight, but to transform society through violence. In these same months, Himmler and Heinrich finished building the operational tools that would move behind any invasion. The Einsatzgruppen, special SS task forces, were organized for security and cleansing operations in occupied territories. Their purpose was explicit: eliminate political leaders, intellectuals, Jews, and anyone considered a danger to German rule. The term security hid its meaning, just as protective custody had hidden Dachau's purpose 6 years earlier. But by now the SS had mastered this language. It could describe murder as administration and still preserve its own self-image. Hitler's final steps to war were public and brutal. In March 1939, he occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, ripping apart Munich's promises. The world protested, but again, no army stopped him. In August, he signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Stalin, clearing the Eastern diplomatic path. And on the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Europe plunged into war. For the Waffen-SS, the name the SSVT would now take Poland, was the moment where ideology met reality. Their units fought alongside the Wehrmacht, often with impressive discipline and aggression. But the SS presence in Poland was never only military. The Einsatzgruppen followed behind, and the Totenkopf units expanded their camp system into occupied land. In other words, the SS invaded Poland as a complete instrument: soldier, policeman, executioner, and administrator. The Wehrmacht conquered territory. The SS conquered society. This is the turning point of the SS story. Up to 1939, it had built a state within a state. It had trained itself in surveillance, terror, and racial engineering. But those systems were still largely contained within Germany and newly annexed lands. War removed the walls. It gave the SS a continental laboratory. The Waffen-SS would grow with every campaign, feeding on myth and battle prestige. The police SS would expand its grip into every occupied city. The camp SS would multiply its machinery into industrial extermination. All three branches were now braided into a single mission: reshape Europe by force, guided by ideology, executed through order. It is important to notice how smoothly this transition happened. There was no sudden new SS born in September 1939. The same habits practiced in Germany's camps, in police stations, and in racial offices simply scaled outward. The SS had prepared for war long before war began. It had prepared by teaching men that obedience was higher than law, that purity was higher than compassion, and that the state's will could rewrite reality. Once an organization believes those three things, war does not change. War merely reveals what it already is. So, as German columns rolled into Poland, the Waffen-SS marched with them in a strange fusion of soldierly pride and ideological trance. Some men believed they were making history. Some simply followed the rhythm of command. But all had been shaped by the same system, and that system was about to show Europe what it meant when belief becomes a weapon, and a weapon is given an empire to use. Poland, the first laboratory of SS rule 1939-1940, when the German army crossed into Poland on the 1st of September 1939, the world saw tanks, aircraft, and columns of soldiers driving fast and hard into a Danziger nation caught unprepared. Blitzkrieg was the visible face of the invasion, but behind that face moved another force, quieter, slower, and in some ways more decisive than armored divisions. This was the SS in its full wartime form, not only as fighters in the Waffen-SS, but as police, administrators, and execution squads. Poland became the first place where the SS could test its empire beyond Germany, and in that testing, it revealed the shape of what the war was truly going to be. The Nazis did not enter Poland with a normal military plan. Their ideology had already decided Poland's fate. In Hitler's racial hierarchy, Poles were not equals to be conquered. They were a population to be broken, reduced, and made useful. Poland was imagined as part of the future German living space, land to be cleared for settlers and turned into a colonial frontier. That meant war would not end when the Polish army fell. War would begin in a second form afterward, a war against society itself. The SS was built for that second form. Even before the invasion, Himmler and Heinrich had organized special SS units called Einsatzgruppen, mobile task forces, assigned to follow the army into newly seized territories. Their orders were chillingly clear: eliminate Polish leadership that might inspire resistance, and begin the racial cleansing that ideology demanded. In practice, this meant targeted murder of professors, priests, teachers, political officials, lawyers, and anyone else who carried authority or education. It also meant immediate, escalating violence against Jewish communities, who were already defined in Nazi thinking as enemies to be removed from Europe. Poland thus became the SS's first great laboratory. The Wehrmacht conquered the SS state. The SS dismantled the people. The two operations were connected, but their logic was different. The army fought battles. The SS erased structures. And the SS did not see itself as committing crimes. It saw itself as carrying out a historical mission. Early Waffen-SS units entered Poland, eager to prove themselves. Many were young, pumped with propaganda, and hungry for respect from the regular army. They fought hard in the opening weeks, sometimes recklessly, and their officers emphasized aggression as proof of ideological toughness. But just as important as their battlefield role was what they did beyond it. In town after town, Waffen-SS soldiers participated in terror against civilians, executions for supposed partisanship, reprisals against villages, and brutal security sweeps. The boundaries between soldiering and policing blurred almost immediately. This blurring was not chaos, it was design. The SS had always been trained to treat war and racial cleansing as the same task. Behind them came the Einsatzgruppen. Their operations were methodical, rooted in lists and intelligence prepared in advance. Polish elites were arrested in waves, often on the basis of local German minority complaints or SS-compiled rosters. Men were taken from their homes at dawn, marched to edges of forests, and shot in group executions. Families were left without explanation. Villages learned overnight that a professor or priest could simply vanish because his existence was inconvenient to the Reich. These killings were part of an SS campaign known as Intelligenzaktion, the deliberate destruction of Poland's intellectual and cultural backbone. The goal was clear. A nation without leaders becomes easier to colonize. Jewish communities in Poland faced immediate terror. In some towns, SS men and police herded Jews into squares, beating them and humiliating them in public before executing selected individuals. Synagogues were burned, businesses were looted, rabbis were forced to perform degrading rituals. These scenes echoed Kristallnacht, but now, violence came with a conqueror's confidence. The SS was learning that occupation removes restraint. In Germany, terror had been partly bureaucratic, executed behind doors. In Poland, terror could be open, performed to frighten the wider population into submission. At first, much of this violence was decentralized. Some actions were driven by local SS commanders improvising cruelty, others by police units acting on broad ideological directives. Yet even in this early phase, the SS was already converting violence into structure. Poland was not merely being punished, it was being reorganized. That reorganization began through ghettos. In late 1939, as the German state partitioned Poland into annexed regions and the general government, the SS helped cordon off Jewish districts in major cities, most famously Warsaw and Łódź. Jews were forced to surrender homes, move into overcrowded neighborhoods, and live behind walls and checkpoints. Officially, ghettos were temporary measures for security and public health. In reality, they were the first stage of removal. The SS was not yet ready for industrial extermination, but it was ready to isolate, deprive, and concentrate populations so that future killing would be easier. Bureaucracy entered genocide like a quiet knife. Poland also became the test ground for forced labor. The SS and German civilian authorities demanded workers for road building, agriculture, and industry. Polish civilians were rounded up in streets and villages, deported to Germany, or forced into local labor camps under harsh conditions. Entire regions were treated as reservoirs of manpower, human fuel for the Reich's machine. The SS understood something crucial here. Terror is not only about killing, it is about extracting value from those you intend to destroy anyway. Forced labor and extermination were not separate ideas. They were two gears in the same mechanism. Even before the war turned global, the SS was experimenting in Poland with mass displacement. Under the policy of Germanization, Polish families were expelled from farms and homes, replaced by German settlers. Some were deported into the general government, others sent to labor camps. Children judged racially valuable were kidnapped and sent for German adoption. Families were broken not for military necessity, but for ideological engineering. A map was being redrawn not only at borders, but inside human lives. In all of this, the SS leaned on a tool it had perfected inside Germany: documentation. Every arrest generated paperwork. Every deportation had lists. Every execution produced a report. The SS bureaucratic mind turned occupation into files. The numbers piled up quickly. By the end of 1939, tens of thousands of Polish elites had been killed. Jewish death tolls surged through shootings, starvation, and the first crude extermination experiments. Yet within SS reports, these lives appeared as statistics, framed as security measures, completed. A cold language of operations smoothed the moral horror, allowing men to feel like professionals rather than killers. The psychological transformation among SS men deepened here. Many entered Poland already indoctrinated. They believed in racial hierarchy, or at least accepted it as the official truth of the regime. But occupation accelerated belief into action. A man could no longer hide behind slogans. He was now face to face with the consequences. Some hardened instantly. For them, cruelty became proof of loyalty. Others hesitated in small, private ways, delaying an SNPPI order avoiding a firing squad, drinking heavily after executions. Yet the SS system had a way of choking hesitation. It rewarded hardness with promotion and praised ruthlessness as virtue. Doubt did not survive long under those rules. The Wehrmacht's attitude toward SS methods in Poland varied. Some army officers were disgusted, others indifferent, and many cooperative. But a critical thing happened. The SS set the tone of occupation. The army moved on to new fronts. The SS stayed. Its police and administrative branches built permanent authority over conquered populations. This was the essence of Himmler's dream: conquest followed by SS reordering. Poland proved that this dream could be executed on a national scale. By early 1940, the SS presence in Poland had thickened into a network. The Gestapo operated across cities. SD officers monitored public moods. Camp systems expanded. The first extermination techniques by gas were being tried at places like Chelmno soon after. Rooted in methods tested across Polish territories, even where formal extermination had not yet begun, starvation became a weapon. Ghettos were sealed with little food. Disease spread in crowded districts. SS officials did not need to pull triggers every day. They could set conditions that made death predictable. It was killing by policy. Poland also sharpened the SS's sense of itself as a ruling elite. In new SS offices in Krakow and Warsaw, officials walked through confiscated estates, sat in seized apartments, and treated Poles as colonial subjects. Their confidence grew with each week of unchallenged power. They began to talk not only about winning the war, but about reshaping Europe afterward. For SS men, Poland was not just a battlefield victory. It was proof that they could organize terror into governance. This period created templates that would echo everywhere later. The sequence became clear: invade, isolate enemies, destroy elites, deport or enslave the rest, settle Germans, record everything, and frame it all as order. Poland showed that the SS could manage a conquered society like a laboratory experiment. It also revealed how quickly genocide could evolve from policy into routine once stable structures were in place. Most importantly, Poland taught the SS that mass murder was not only possible, it was administratively manageable. It could be planned in offices, executed in forests, logged in files, and explained in sterile language. The organization learned that the world might protest diplomatically, but it would not intervene militarily for Polish civilians or Polish Jews. That lesson was as deadly as any gunshot. It told Himmler and Heinrich that the limits of violence were not moral. They were practical, and practical limits can always be pushed. By the summer of 1940, Poland had been transformed. Its state was gone, its elites decimated, its Jewish population imprisoned behind walls, its countryside scarred by expulsions and forced labor. The SS stood over this ruin, like an architect surveying the first stage of construction. The laboratory had worked. Now Himmler's empire knew what it could do, and more dangerously, it knew how to do it efficiently. Poland was only the beginning. The SS had tasted the power of shaping society through terror, and it had discovered the terrible comfort of routine cruelty. When Germany turned west in 1940, and then east in 1941, the SS would carry the Polish blueprint with it, scaled larger, refined, colder, and driven by the certainty that it was no longer experimenting. The West and the turning eastward, 1,941,941. In the spring of 1940, the war shifted with breathtaking speed. Germany stormed into Denmark and Norway, then smashed through the Low Countries and France. The world watched an old European order collapse in weeks. Paris fell. The British fled at Dunkirk. On the surface, this looked like a war won by tanks, aircraft, and the disciplined momentum of the Wehrmacht. Yet beneath the drama of military conquest the SS was quietly expanding its empire. Poland had been the first laboratory of SS rule. Western Europe would be the second different kind of laboratory, where the SS learned how to govern conquered peoples who were not Slavs and not immediately marked for annihilation, but for subjugation, exploitation, and eventual reordering. The SS entered the West with two faces. One was the Waffen-SS, now deeper in the war. Machine, fighting alongside the army and gaining prestige. The other was the police and security SS, led by the Gestapo and SD, who followed behind the front lines to seize control of political life, eliminate resistance, and enforce Nazi racial policy. The West taught the SS how to run an occupation in velvet gloves that could harden into iron whenever needed. In France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, the SS did not face a society already collapsing into chaos like Poland. These were modern, bureaucratic states, with intact institutions, functioning cities, and populations who did not expect conquest to rewrite their lives overnight. So, SS rule adapted. It learned to work through existing systems, infiltrating police forces, recruiting local collaborators, and using law as a weapon. Himmler's empire had always relied on bureaucracy. In the West, bureaucracy became even more essential because violence had to be disguised as normal governance. The Gestapo and SD established headquarters in occupied capitals and provincial towns, often commandeering hotels, government buildings, or police stations. Their first focus was resistance. Networks of communists, trade union leaders, former politicians, and underground organizers were tracked, arrested, and interrogated. The SS intelligence apparatus blended surveillance with intimidation. Informants were cultivated. Files grew thick with names. The terror was quieter than Poland's firing squads, but no less real. People learned quickly that the SS could reach into any apartment, any workplace, any cafe. Fear did not need spectacle when it could become a constant undertone of daily life. At the same time, the SS enforced racial measures in Western Europe with chilling efficiency. Jews were registered, marked, and excluded from public life, often through local civil services, now working under German supervision. In the Netherlands, meticulous population records became tools for persecution. In France, Vichy authorities cooperated, passing anti-Jewish statutes and assisting with arrests. The SS learned that occupation could harness local prejudice, local ambition, and local fear. The machinery of persecution did not have to be imported whole. It could be grafted onto the existing body of society. During these months, deportations began. Jews in Western Europe were arrested and transported eastward toward ghettos and camps already operating in Poland. At this stage, many in the West did not know what the East had become. Deportation was framed as relocation or labor. Official notices sounded administrative, not murderous. Yet the SS was already connecting the West to the killing system it had begun building in Poland. Trains were schedules, lists compiled. Bureaucracy became the bridge between ordinary life and annihilation. What had started as isolation in cities like Warsaw was now spreading across the continent. For the Waffen-SS, the Western campaigns were crucial in another way. They were a proving ground for military legitimacy. Waffen-SS divisions fought in France with aggressive speed, often suffering high casualties, then claiming elite status through sacrifice. Their commanders pushed a narrative of ideological superiority. SS men, they said, fought harder because they believed more deeply. Hitler encouraged this image because it strengthened SS independence while also motivating recruits. Himmler encouraged it because every battlefield triumph expanded his political leverage. And so, in the summer of 1940, as Europe reeled from German victory, the Waffen-SS emerged from the shadow of SS policing into the myth of frontline glory. This myth mattered. It allowed the SS to recruit larger numbers, to present itself as the future of German warfare, and to blur its role in genocide behind a facade of soldierly honor. A young recruit, in 1940, could join the Waffen-SS thinking of himself as a warrior elite, not an enforcer of racial terror. The SS understood how powerful that illusion was. It would become one of its greatest shields in the years to come. Yet even in the West, the SS did not abandon the brutal instincts Poland had awakened. When resistance flared, reprisals were savage. Hostages were shot. Villages suspected of harboring partisans were punished. Jewish neighborhoods were raided with violence. The difference was not cruelty versus kindness. It was tempo. The SS in the West could choose when to be overtly brutal and when to cloak brutality in legality. That flexibility made the SS more dangerous, not less. It showed Himmler's empire could adapt its terror to any landscape. By late 1940, another transformation was underway, one far larger than the occupation of France or Holland. Hitler was turning, his gaze east again. His hatred of Bolshevism and his obsession with Lebensraum had never disappeared. The victories in the West were not an endpoint. They were a springboard. The Reich had to expand into the Soviet Union, he believed, or it would wither. This war, the coming war in the East, would not resemble the West. It would be total, racial, apocalyptic, and the SS was preparing itself to be the central instrument of that apocalypse. Inside SS leadership circles, planning for a vast Eastern campaign accelerated. Heydrich refined the Einsatzgruppen concept into larger, more organized, killing forces. 4 main Einsatzgruppen were assembled, each subdivided into Einsatzkommandos and Sonderkommandos. Their mission was clear long before the first tank crossed the Soviet border. They would eliminate Jews, communist officials, and anyone considered a racial or political threat. Poland had taught the SS how to kill on a mass scale behind a moving front. Now that method would be carried into a space infinitely larger. Himmler also intensified colonization planning. The SS Race and Settlement Office drafted schemes for resettling millions of Germans into the East after victory. Slavic populations were to be partially enslaved, partially expelled, and partially starved. The language of these plans was chillingly clinical. Population transfers, security zones, ethnic cleansing. Once again, ideology became paperwork. The East was being imagined not as a battlefield, but as a canvas where the SS would redraw humanity. Training within the Waffen-SS shifted accordingly. Recruits were drilled not only in combat, but in ideological endurance. Officers spoke openly of the coming war as a racial struggle, a test of the SS mission. Soldiers were told they would face subhumans and Bolshevik beasts. Such language was not sloppy propaganda. It was preparation. If you want men to commit atrocities, you must first teach them that the victims exist outside the boundaries of moral imagination. The SS had already done this in Poland. Now, it was institutionalizing the lesson for the largest war in history. During the winter of 1940-41, Germany's eastern infrastructure began to hum. Rail lines were repaired, supplies stockpiled, divisions moved quietly towards staging areas. The Wehrmacht planned battles. The SS planned societies. Both machines were aligning toward a single direction. Yet the SS brought to this alignment something the army did not: a prepared system of extermination. By early 1941, the occupation of the West continued, often in deceptive calm. Life in Paris resumed with cafes and markets, even as persecution loomed beneath the routines. The SS maintained order, extracted labor, seized assets, and deported Jews. The West was being drained to feed the Reich's war economy. Forced labor quotas rose. Prisoners and workers were shipped to Germany. SS administrators refined their methods of exploitation. Here too the SS learned something important. War was not only about destroying enemies, but about turning conquered peoples into resources. The bureaucratic empire of Himmler stretched from camps to factories, from police headquarters to rail timetables. This exploitation in the West also deepened complicity. Local collaborators became invested in SS success. Businesses profited from confiscated Jewish property. Police units gained power by cooperating with Gestapo demands. Ordinary citizens adjusted their lives to occupation, sometimes in quiet resistance, sometimes in quiet surrender. The SS thrived in such environments. Its genius was never only violence. It was the way it could make a society participate in its own subjugation. And then, in June 1941, the waiting ended. Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. The invasion of the Soviet Union was not simply a military gamble. It was the moment where SS ideology would meet its fullest expression. The East was the promised land of SS myth, vast, harsh, and defined in Nazi fantasy as a populated wilderness to be cleared and remade. As the Wehrmacht surged forward, the SS moved in its shadow exactly as it had in Poland, but now with far greater scale and certainty. Einsatzgruppen followed behind the front. Waffen-SS divisions fought alongside army units. Police battalions secured towns. Camp planners began designing a new lattice of detention and labor sites. The SS entered the Soviet Union not as guests, in a war run by someone else. They entered as architects of a racial crusade. The West, in hindsight, was not just another occupied region. It was a proving ground for SS flexibility and a reservoir of resources for the greater war to come. The SS learned how to govern without constant mass shootings, how to blend terror into law, how to make occupation appear routine. But more importantly, it learned how to expand its machinery across borders without resistance strong enough to stop it. That confidence carried directly into Barbarossa. So by the summer of 1941, the SS stood at a convergence point. It was simultaneously a frontline army, a police state, an intelligence web, and a colonial planning office. Its men were told they were soldiers and priests of destiny. Its bureaucrats believed they were engineers of a new Europe. Its killers believed they were purifying history itself. The war in the East would strip away any remaining disguises. In Poland, the SS had tested method. In Western Europe, it had refined control. In the Soviet Union, it would unleash scale, and in that scale, the SS would step fully into the darkest chapter of its existence, not just occupying nations, but annihilating peoples. What it had been building for almost a decade was about to roar into life. Barbarossa and the Killing Fields, 1941. When the German invasion of the Soviet Union began on the 22nd of June, 1941, it did not open a normal front. It opened a world where every rule of war was replaced by ideology. In the Nazi imagination, the East was not only territory to be taken, it was a racial battlefield, a place where history itself would be purified through destruction. For the Wehrmacht, Barbarossa meant annihilating the Red Army and taking strategic cities. For the SS, Barbarossa meant something deeper and more terrible, reshaping the human map of Eastern Europe by removing entire populations. Poland had been a rehearsal. Western Europe had been a lesson in control. The Soviet Union was to be the final stage, not a laboratory this time, but a furnace. The SS entered the East, already trained for what it would do there. It had the doctrine, the personnel, the bureaucracy, and most importantly, the moral permission. The Reich's leadership had decided that this war would be fought without restraint, and it gave the SS the role of executing that decision. 4 Einsatzgruppen followed the German armies into Soviet territory. They were not improvised militias. They were carefully organized SS task forces, each attached to a major army group and subdivided into smaller killing units. Their orders were given in language that sounded like security. They were to eliminate Bolshevik functionaries, partisans, and dangerous elements. But in SS vocabulary, those categories were elastic. They stretched easily to include Jews, Roma, communist officials, intellectuals, and any civilian considered an obstacle to German rule. In practice, the Einsatzgruppen were mobile death squads, staffed by SS, SD, police battalions, and sometimes supported by local collaborators. Their mission was to kill quickly, in large numbers, and to make those killings look like order. At first, the killings targeted men, Jewish men, party officials, village leaders. The logic followed the SS blueprint from Poland. First, remove the people who could resist. But within weeks, the violence widened. The ideology driving Barbarossa demanded not just security, but cleansing. Killing only male leaders was not enough. Women and children, entire families, were reclassified as threats simply because they existed. The SS did not have to write a new doctrine. It only had to follow the implications of the doctrine it already believed. The process of murder was grimly consistent. SS men would enter a town with lists prepared in advance or built from local informants. Jews were ordered to assemble in squares or synagogues under the pretense of registration or resettlement. They were marched to ravines, forests, or open pits dug by forced laborers. They were stripped of valuables, watches, rings, coats, shoes, sometimes forced to undress. Then they were shot in groups, falling into the pits like cords cut at once. The SS logged the numbers afterward in reports sent to Berlin. The killings were framed as successful operations. In those reports, the dead appeared not as humans but as totals. This was not random brutality. It was a method. It combined ideological certainty with administrative precision. The SS had learned that murder is easier when it becomes routine. Each town became a repetition of the last. Each massacre taught the next massacre how to be faster. The men who carried out the shootings often spoke of their work in terms of discipline and duty. Some were repulsed at first, but the system was designed to absorb repulsion. A man who hesitated was reassigned or mocked. A man who complied was praised. Alcohol lubricated nerves at night. The next morning, orders reset the day. Barbarossa did not merely uncover violence inside SS men. It forged violence into habit. One of the most devastating aspects of the Eastern Campaign was how quickly it swallowed anyone nearby. Wehrmacht soldiers sometimes watched shootings in silence. Some protested, many did not. Army commanders issued their own, ruthless orders against supposed partisans. And those orders created a gray fog where civilian life had no protection. The SS did not operate in isolation. It operated within an atmosphere where ideology had already stripped victims of moral status. The East became a zone where law had been suspended by belief. As the German armies pushed deeper, the Einsatzgruppen expanded their reach. They were aided by Ordnungspolizei battalions, regular German police units that had been militarized for occupation. These battalions, often made of middle-aged reservists rather than fanatical SS recruits, carried out mass shootings alongside the SS. Their participation revealed a truth the SS system depended on. When murder is framed as policy, ordinary men can be turned into executioners without needing personal hatred. The state gives the task, the uniform gives permission, and routine gives numbness. Barbarossa was not only a crime of ideology, it was a factory of complicity. The largest massacres shocked even some perpetrators. At Babi Yar outside Kiev, tens of thousands of Jews were shot in a ravine over just 2 days in late September 1941. The scale was staggering. Yet, the SS treated it as a logistical achievement. The killing squads worked in shifts. The ravine was layered with bodies. When the shooting ended, the units moved on to the next city, as if finishing a grim assignment. Babi Yar was not an exception. It was a symbol of what Barbarossa had become: genocide. By bullets, By the late summer and fall of 1941, the SS leadership faced a problem of scale. Mass shootings were effective, but psychologically and logistically burdensome. They required ammunition, manpower, secrecy, and constant movement. They also left witnesses and left bodies. Himmler and Heinrich started searching for a more efficient way to kill. That word efficient is the hinge of this chapter. It is where barbarism moved from the open air into the industrial room. The SS had already tested gas vans in Poland. Now, it considered killing by gas as a solution to the limitations of shooting. Not because gas was more humane, but because it was easier for the killers and easier to organize. The East also triggered a new escalation in Nazi policy. Before Barbarossa, Hitler's regime had spoken about expulsion, ghettos, and degradation. Genocide existed in practice, even if not yet formalized as a continent-wide final plan. Barbarossa changed that. The invasion unleashed the logic of total racial war. The SS began to treat extermination not as a set of harsh measures, but as the war's very purpose. In Berlin, the language inside SS offices shifted. Numbers from the Einsatzgruppen reports were studied not with horror, but with calculation. Killing was becoming an administrative norm. The question was no longer, should we? It was, how best? Meanwhile, the SS was building a colonial future on top of the killing present. In occupied Soviet territories, Himmler's planners drafted schemes for German settlements. Whole villages were emptied. Food was seized. Civilians were starved deliberately under the hunger plan because Nazi ideology judged Slavic populations expendable. The SS imagined clearing vast zones, repopulating them with Germans, and turning survivors into laborers. This plan depended on terror not just as a weapon, but as an ecosystem. Genocide and colonization were two faces of the same dream. For local populations, the arrival of the SS meant that survival depended on invisibility. Jews fled into forests, hiding in barns, crawling into basements. Some were sheltered by neighbors. Many were hunted down. The SS offered rewards for denunciations. It also cultivated collaborators, especially among those who saw Germans as liberators from Soviet rule. In Lithuania, Ukraine, Latvia, and elsewhere, local militias participated in pogroms and roundups. The SS exploited these tensions cynically, knowing that shared guilt welded collaboration into permanence. A man who has helped kill his neighbor is less likely to resist later. Barbarossa turned entire regions into moral ruins. Inside the SS, Barbarossa also tested faith. The war in the East was brutal, even for German soldiers. Heat, mud, endless roads, bitter winters, partisan attacks, and staggering casualties. Waffen-SS divisions fought with ferocity, sometimes earning admiration even from the army. Yet, their ferocity was not only tactical, it was ideological. They were told that retreat was betrayal and mercy was weakness. Many fought like men closed inside a myth, because they were. Their casualties were high. Their resentment against civilians grew. That resentment fed further atrocities. In the East, battlefield and genocide fed each other in a spiral. The SS did not merely follow the war. It shaped its moral atmosphere. Himmler himself toured the Eastern Front. He watched shootings and reportedly recoiled at the sight, not because he was moved by victims, but because the act was messy and hard on his men. His solution was not to stop killing, but to redesign killing so that SS men could endure it better. This is one of the most revealing glimpses into SS psychology. The concern was not the suffering of the murdered, it was the burden on the murderers. In Himmler's logic, the SS was sacrificing its soul for the Reich, and the Reich owed it a cleaner method of sacrifice. That logic would help pave the way for extermination camps. By December 1941, the scale of murder in the East had reached a point that could no longer be described as local operations. Over 1 million Jews had already been killed by shootings alone. Entire towns vanished. Ravines and forests became cemeteries without stones. The SS had turned huge stretches of Europe into killing zones. Yet even then, the process was still expanding. Barbarossa was not a phase that would end with winter. It was a door that had been thrown open, and through it came the next stage of modern atrocity. The SS had learned 3 decisive lessons in 1941. First, mass murder could be executed rapidly and repeatedly if wrapped in administrative form. Second, ordinary men could become participants if the structure made cruelty feel like duty. Third, the only limits were logistical, not moral. These lessons were soaked into the SS mind by blood, and once learned, they could not be unlearned. So even as German armies stalled before Moscow and Hitler declared war on the United States in December, the SS was not thinking of defeat. It was thinking of systems. The killing fields of 1941 were already becoming the foundation for a larger, colder architecture. The bullets in the ravines were a beginning, not an endpoint. What came next would be more organized, more efficient, and far more devastating. The SS had transformed the East into a world where murder was normal policy. Soon it would transform Europe into a machine where murder became routine industry. Barbarossa was the year the SS stopped pretending to be anything but what it was. The Black Order was no longer only a state within a state. It had become a continent within a grave. The final solution becomes a system. 1942. By the start of 1942, the war had entered a brutal winter, but the SS had entered something colder, still the full transformation of genocide into a permanent system. The mass shootings of 1941 had already killed more than 1 million Jews in the East. Towns had been emptied, ravines filled, forests turned into silent cemeteries. Yet, in the eyes of Himmler and Heinrich, this was only the beginning. The killings by bullets were vast, but they were not complete. They were also, to SS minds, inefficient. They required manpower and ammunition. They left witnesses. They exhausted the shooters. And perhaps most troubling to Nazi planners, they were not organized enough to reach every corner of occupied Europe. If the SS was going to fulfill its ideological mission, it needed a method that could operate like machinery, predictable, scalable, and easily administered. So, in 1942, the SS shifted genocide from fieldwork to infrastructure. It was no longer just something that followed the army. It became something built into railways, offices, and camps. The murder of a people turned from a series of actions into a bureaucratic project with schedules, quotas, and departments. The SS had always believed order was sacred. Now it applied sacred order to extermination. The turning point came in January, at a villa on the shore of Berlin's Wannsee Lake. The meeting there did not invent genocide. It organized it. Senior SS leaders and representatives of German ministries assembled to coordinate what they called the final solution of the Jewish question. Their language was carefully sterilized. They spoke of evacuations, resettlement, labor deployment. Under those words lay a practical truth already decided. Europe's Jews were to be murdered, not sporadically, not locally, but completely. The conference mapped which agencies would handle deportations, who would supply trains, who would manage property seizures, and how Jewish populations would be categorized by age, nationality, and labor capacity. The SS wanted destruction to function like policy, not like chaos. Wannsee was the moment genocide fully entered paperwork. With that coordination secured, the SS expanded the extermination camp system. Concentration camps had existed since 1933, but now a new category took shape. Camps designed not for imprisonment, but for immediate death. At Chelmno, gassing vans were already in operation. In 1942, the SS built the Operation Reinhard camps in occupied Poland, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, each designed purely for killing. Unlike Dachau or Buchenwald, which had evolved into sprawling complexes of terror, these camps were stripped to essentials. They were not meant to hold populations, they were meant to erase them. The architecture reflected this purpose. Trains arrived at hidden platforms. Victims were forced into reception, areas that disguised the process as registration. They were ordered to undress for disinfection. Their belongings were sorted into piles that would be shipped back to Germany. Then they were driven through narrow fenced passages toward gas chambers. The SS called these passages the tube. The language itself revealed the industrial imagination at work. People were being processed through a system like raw material through machinery. In the gas chambers, carbon monoxide, or Zyklon B, ended lives within minutes. Bodies were dragged out, searched for valuables, burned in pits or crematoria. The SS timed each step, refined it, improved throughput. The camps operated day and night. The killing was no longer episodic, it was continuous. Auschwitz became the symbol of this industrialization. Originally established as a concentration camp, it expanded into a Saal complex with multiple functions: imprisonment, forced labor, and mass extermination. In 1942, Auschwitz-Birkenau's gas chambers and crematoria were built on a scale unmatched anywhere else. In one place, the SS combined three aims of its empire: terror, exploitation, and annihilation. Trains carried Jews from across Europe, France, the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, Greece, Hungary, Italy, even Norway. Many arrived believing they were being resettled. That belief did not last long. At platform selections, SS doctors and officers separated those deemed fit for labor from those marked for immediate death. A gesture of the hand decided fate in seconds. The SS allowed just enough routine, just enough visible order to keep panic manageable. Then the system swallowed its victims. Behind this machinery stood men who wrote reports, filed forms, and watched clocks. Commandants monitored capacity and output. The SS bureaucracy treated ashes as data. Daily numbers were transmitted upward. If a transport arrived late, Berlin asked why. If crematoria broke down, engineers were summoned. If a camp needed more Zyklon B, requisitions were sent. The system's cruelty lay not only in murder, but in how murder was made to look normal. A clerk could schedule deportation trains and still go home believing he had done administrative work. The SS had succeeded in turning moral catastrophe into logistical routine. The deportations themselves required coordination on a continental scale. In occupied countries, Gestapo offices compiled lists with the help of local police and civil registries. Jews were ordered to report for labor or captured in raids. They were herded into temporary holding camps and ghettos until transports were ready. Train cars, often cattle, wagons, were packed far beyond capacity. People traveled for days without enough water, without toilets, without air. Many died before reaching the camps. The SS did not consider these deaths wasteful. They were simply part of the process. The SS also expanded forced labor during this year. German industry was desperate for workers. Himmler made the camps part of the war economy. Those spared immediate death were thrown into labor battalions. They mined coal, built roads, manufactured weapons in underground factories. Their bodies became fuel to keep the Reich alive. Yet, this exploitation was inseparable from extermination. Labor was not a path to survival. It was a slower route to death. The SS calculated how long a worker could be used before collapsing. Behind the cold efficiency of production quotas lay a worldview that treated humans as disposable parts. Work, in SS logic, was another form of selection. For the SS men running the camps, this year settled genocide into habit. Many of the commandants were not raving fanatics. They were administrators. Some worried about theft among guards. Some worried about morale. Some worried about efficiency. Their concerns were about management, not morality. Rudolf Höss at Auschwitz kept detailed diaries about improving the killing process and maximizing crematoria output. His tone was practical. That practicality was itself a horror. It showed the SS did not depend on emotional hatred. It depended on obedience and routine. The machine could run with men who thought they were professionals. Yet even inside the SS, cracks of strain appeared. The scale of death was so immense that even hardened perpetrators were affected. Some officers drank heavily. Some requested transfers. Others became numb. Himmler responded by framing their role as sacred sacrifice. He told SS leaders that extermination was a moral burden they were carrying for the Reich. He praised their decency for enduring it. This inversion of morality was central to SS self-justification. They did not see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as guardians, forced to do terrible work for a higher cause. In that mental world, the greater the atrocity, the greater the virtue of endurance. Meanwhile, the victims resisted in ways the SS never fully understood. In ghettos, underground networks formed. Families hid children. People forged papers. Some fled into forests and joined partisans. In camps, revolts were rare because the system was designed to crush possibility. Yet even here, resistance existed in whispered prayers, in smuggled notes, in a refusal to surrender identity. At Sobibor and Treblinka later, prisoners would rise in revolt, proving that even within extermination camps, the human instinct to fight could survive. But in 1942, the SS still believed the system was invincible. The reach of the final solution widened relentlessly. In occupied Soviet territories, shootings continued. In Poland and Axis, Western Europe, deportations accelerated. In Croatia and Romania, Allied regimes coordinated their own killings with SS guidance. In Germany itself, Jews who had survived earlier persecution were rounded up and sent east. The SS pursued totality. It would not be satisfied with partial destruction. Every Jewish community was to be traced, captured, and eliminated. The machinery expanded like a net tightening across the continent, and 1942 was also the year the SS became openly confident in its role as master of life and death. Himmler's authority grew. He controlled police, security, intelligence, camps, and the Waffen-SS. He spoke of the SS as the order of the future, the seed of a purified empire. In his imagination, genocide was not a crime, but a creative act. The extermination camps were not stains, but foundations. The SS was building a world by destroying one. This delusion allowed the machine to keep running, even as bodies piled into the millions. The outside world began to hear rumors. Allied intelligence received reports from occupied Europe. The Polish underground smuggled information about Treblinka and Auschwitz. Refugees told stories that sounded impossible. Some believed, many did not. The scale of SS killing defied comprehension. That incomprehension was part of the SS advantage. The world could not imagine a state devoting railways, engineers, doctors, and clerks to murder. Yet that is precisely what the SS had done. By the end of 1942, the final solution was no longer a policy in motion. It was a functioning system. The SS had fused ideology with infrastructure so completely that genocide became a routine act of governance. Just as earlier SS offices had regulated marriage and ancestry, now SS departments regulated arrival, schedules, and cremation levels. The same devotion to order that had built their racial elite now built an empire of death. In the quiet rhythm of this system, something even darker happened. The killing became self-sustaining. Each camp required staff, guards, railway officials, civil, registrars, and industrial partners. Thousands participated, and participation created complicity. Complicity created silence. Silence kept the machine running. The SS had not only killed its victims, it had infected occupied Europe with a structure of fear and cooperation that made resistance harder and made denial easier. Still, the war outside this system continued. At Stalingrad, German armies were breaking beneath Soviet counterattacks. The Wehrmacht was bleeding. The myth of quick victory was dying. But inside SS offices and camps, the logic remained unchanged. If anything, defeat intensified their urgency. They believed they had to complete their mission while time remained. In SS thinking, genocide was not separate from war. It was war. The war for racial destiny mattered more than any battlefield. So 1942 stands as the year where the SS reached its most complete form. It was no longer simply a guard, nor merely a secret police, nor only an army. It was a civilization-shaped machine, built on obedience, myth, bureaucracy, and murder. The final solution became its greatest project, a project so vast that even modern language struggles to hold it. And as the SS system reached full speed, it carried Europe into a darkness so organized, so methodical, that it would forever change how humanity understood evil, not as madness, but as administration, not as chaos, but as routine, not as sudden eruption, but as a system built quietly, step by step, file by file, until the smoke rose every day, and the world learned what the SS at war's high tide and turning point, 1943. By 1943, the SS stood at the widest reach it would ever have. Its black insignia was everywhere in the trenches, in police offices, in camp gates, and in the files moving through Berlin. On paper, Himmler's order looked unstoppable. The Waffen-SS had swollen into a massive fighting force. The SS police and SD watched every street. The camp system fed German industry and devoured Europe's Jews. The Empire of Terror was not only functioning, it was expanding. And yet, 1943 was also the year the SS began to feel something it had long denied: the weight of reality pushing back. The myth of destiny collided with the arithmetic of war. The SS had always believed it was chosen, protected by blood and belief. But belief could not stop Soviet tanks, Allied bombers, or the slow collapse of German manpower. The order was at its high tide, and every high tide is already turning. The shock that set the tone for this year had come at Stalingrad. Germany's defeat there in February 1943 was more than a military loss. It was a collapse of the Reich's illusion of invincibility. Entire armies froze and died on the Volga. For the SS, Stalingrad hit like heresy. These were men raised on the idea that discipline and racial faith would overcome any obstacle. Yet faith did not feed starving soldiers or warm bodies in broken winter trenches. The Waffen-SS fought ferociously in the east, but even their ferocity could not restore what had been lost. The front was shifting backward, and the SS, for the first time, had to imagine something it had never trained for: defeat. Still, the SS did not slow down. In fact, it accelerated the parts of its empire that were still under its control. As Germany began to lose ground, the SS clung more tightly to its ideological mission, especially genocide. It was as if the leadership understood, without saying it aloud, that time might be shortening. If the Reich could not win the war in the usual sense, it would at least complete the racial war it had begun. In the extermination camps, the killing continued relentlessly. Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec were still operating, swallowing transport after transport from ghettos across Eastern Europe. Auschwitz expanded further, its crematoria working constantly, its rail lines carrying new convoys every day. The SS now treated genocide the way a collapsing company treats its most important product line, kept at full output even when everything else was failing. Killing was not a side project. It was a core purpose. In Himmler's mind, extermination was the one victory that could not be negotiated away. But even the camps began to show fractures. In Warsaw and other ghettos, Jews understood what deportation meant. The illusion of resettlement had died. So when the SS announced new roundups in April 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto rose in armed rebellion. The fighters were weak, poorly armed, starving. Yet they fought anyway. For weeks, they held off SS units far better equipped. The SS response was merciless and surgical. Jürgen Stroop's men burned buildings block by block, turning the ghetto into fire and rubble. Stroop reported the operation in cold bureaucratic language, boasting of numbers killed, captured, and buildings destroyed. Yet between his lines was a truth that terrified the SS. Even within a system built to erase hope, people could still resist. The rebellion did not stop SS policy. It hardened it. Himmler praised Stroop for crushing the uprising as a warning. In SS culture, resistance was proof of impurity and thus justification for more brutal purification. The order interpreted defiance as infection. And so, as the year unfolded, the killings continued with renewed severity. At the same time, Himmler's SS empire was turning ever more deeply into an economic machine. German industry was desperate. Men were dying at the front. Bombing raids were destroying factories. To keep the war alive, Himmler expanded the use of forced labor. Camps became supplier pools for ammunition plants, construction sites, and underground mines. The SS signed contracts with major firms, leasing prisoners out like disposable tools. The logic was chillingly consistent. If a prisoner could work, he would be worked to exhaustion. If he collapsed, he would be replaced. There was no contradiction between extermination and exploitation in SS thinking. One fed the other. Forced labor extracted the last usable strength from victims. Extermination removed what remained. The Waffen-SS also grew larger in 1943, but its growth revealed a hidden rot. In the early years, the Waffen-SS had been sold as a racial elite. Now, losses were so high that standards eroded. Recruits were taken from occupied Europe, Dutch, Flemish, Scandinavians, Baltic volunteers, even conscripts from regions the Nazis had once deemed inferior. Himmler justified this shift in new language, claiming these men could be Germanized through service. But the truth was simpler. The SS needed bodies. The elite brotherhood was becoming a patchwork army, held together more by fear and training than by ideology. This did not make the Waffen-SS less brutal. In many places, it made it more. So, units with mixed motivation often proved themselves through cruelty, eager to display devotion that they could not prove by bloodline. The SS also tightened repression inside Germany. The war had changed the mood at home. The early years of victory had brought pride, even enthusiasm. By 1943, cities were burning under Allied bombers, rationing grew harsher, and grief sharpened everywhere. People were still afraid to speak openly, but doubt was spreading quietly. Himmler responded with the instinct of every SS planner. More surveillance, more arrests, more examples. The Gestapo increased. Executions for defeatism. SD informants filled factories and neighborhoods. The SS tried to hold the Reich together with the same tool it had always used, terror shaped into routine. But terror is a solvent, not a glue. It can stop voices, but it cannot restore belief. After Stalingrad, the German leadership attempted to rally the nation for total war. Goebbels cried for sacrifice, for unity, for a final all-out effort. The SS embraced this rhetoric because it fit its own internal religion. To the SS mind, suffering was not a sign of failure. It was proof of holiness. Himmler framed the war's hardships as purification, a harsh test that only the strongest were meant to endure. This language mattered because it allowed SS men who were exhausted, frightened, or doubtful to reinterpret their suffering as moral triumph. The SS had always been skilled at turning pain into meaning. In 1943, that skill became essential for survival. Still, reality kept pushing forward. Soviet offensives reclaimed territory. German units retreated from Kharkov, from the Donbass, from the long line of occupied villages. With each retreat came a new SS policy: erase evidence. In the east, SS units began digging up mass graves from the 1,941 shootings and burning the bodies to conceal crimes. This became known as Action 1005. Prisoners were forced to exhume corpses, stack them on pyres, and then were often killed to eliminate witnesses. The SS was trying to rewrite the landscape before the Red Army arrived. Their obsession with secrecy revealed something new. For the first time, the SS was acting not like a conqueror, but like a criminal anticipating capture. This year also reshaped the inner atmosphere of the SS. The order had been built on certainty. Its doctrine said German blood was destined to rule, the Reich was eternal, and Himmler's elite would inherit the future. But certainty is fragile when the world refuses to cooperate. SS men at the front began to see that victory was not guaranteed. They watched comrades die in endless numbers. They passed villages already reduced to ash. They fought partisans who would not vanish. They began to sense that history was pushing back with teeth. Yet SS culture did not allow open doubt. Doubt was impurity, so doubt went underground. It appeared in letters never sent, in drinking, in sudden brutality flaring at the smallest provocation. Some officers became more fanatical, clinging harder to ideology as the walls closed in. Others became purely functional, obeying orders because they did not know how to do anything else. Both responses served the SS machine. Fanaticism fueled it. Habit kept it moving. The paradox of 1943 is that SS power was still vast, but its foundation was weakening. The organization was like a giant building whose outer walls still stood firm, while the interior beams began to warp. The camps ran. The trains still moved. The Gestapo still filled prisons. Divisions still fought across Europe, but the rhythm was changing from expansion to desperation. The SS was no longer building towards a future. It was holding on to a present that was starting to disintegrate. And in that disintegration, the first clear outlines of the SS end began to appear. Not in speeches, not in banners, but in policy decisions, in recruitment standards lowered, in evidence burned, in forced labor pushed past all rational limits, in the savage insistence that extermination must continue even when front lines were collapsing. These choices were not the signs of confidence. They were the signs of a machine that understood, perhaps, without admitting it, that time was running out. Still, to the victims inside camps and ghettos, time did not feel like hope. 1943 was another year of hunger, selection, disease, beating, and smoke. The SS system was still strong enough to kill. The order was still disciplined enough to function. The turning point of war meant little when you were trapped inside a world where life could be ended on a whim. Yet even there, the knowledge that Germany was losing began to spread in whispers. Prisoners heard distant artillery. They saw fewer guards, younger guards, more frantic guards. They sensed shifts in transports and command. Hope returned not as certainty, but as a faint rumor that survival might be possible. Near the end of the year, that rumor sparked another act of defiance. At Sobibor, prisoners planned a revolt. They lured SS officers into workshops, killed them silently, seized weapons, and tried to escape. Many died in the attempt, but hundreds fled into surrounding forests. The revolt forced the SS to shut Sobibor down soon after. Even in the heart of extermination, the SS had discovered its control could be pierced. Its system was terrifyingly powerful, but not invulnerable. That is what 1943 revealed. The SS could still kill faster than anyone could resist, but it could no longer pretend its world was eternal. The war was turning. The Reich was bleeding. The SS empire was cracking under its own weight. Its leaders responded not by yielding, but by tightening every screw on victims, on soldiers, on civilians, on itself. In this year, the SS did not soften. It sharpened. It became more ruthless, because weakness was unthinkable. It became more systematic, because chaos frightened it. It became more desperate, because defeat was approaching, even if no one dared to name it. The Black Order stood at its high tide, and yet the water had already begun to leave the shore. What followed in 1944 would be the SS in full retreat, still lethal, still disciplined, but now driven by fear and survival rather than destiny. The spiral had begun, and as with all spirals of fanaticism, the closer it came to collapse, the more violently it would lash out. Collapse and fury. The SS in 1944. In 1944, the SS reached a strange, terrifying contradiction. It was larger than ever, richer than ever, armed and spread across more territory than at any time in its history. Yet, it was also closer than ever to destruction. The Reich was bleeding on every front. Allied bombers turned German cities into skeletons. The Red Army rolled westward, like a storm that could not be stopped. And inside this collapsing world, the SS did what it had always done when faced with threat. It tightened its grip, sharpened its violence, and tried to force reality to obey ideology. To understand the SS in 1944 is to understand an empire that had lost its future but refused to lose its faith. The order that was born from loyalty was now clinging to survival. Its leaders still spoke of destiny, but their tone had changed. It was no longer the calm certainty of triumph. It was the brittle insistence of men staring into a void. The year opened with disaster in the east. Soviet offensives shattered German lines in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic regions. Operation Bagration in the summer wiped out Army Group Center and drove the Wehrmacht backward at a scale that stunned even seasoned commanders. Waffen-SS divisions fought with ferocity, but ferocity could not compensate for exhausted men, failing logistics, and an enemy that had learned how to defeat them. The SS units that once marched forward as conquerors now retreated through burned villages and frozen fields, leaving behind a trail of destruction that was part strategy, part panic. The retreat changed the character of the Waffen-SS. Earlier in the war, SS formations had been praised as elite shock troops. By 1944, they were an army stretched beyond its own myth. Losses were catastrophic. Replacements came from everywhere. Teenagers, conscripts from occupied lands, men who were not ideologically 12 for the reckoned, trained men who did not share the old SS devotion. The Waffen-SS still fought hard, sometimes fanatically hard, but the aura of the racial priesthood was fading. What remained was a brutal military machine, fueled by survival and habit as much as belief. In the West, the SS faced another catastrophe: the Allied landings in Normandy on June 6. When the beaches erupted with American, British, and Canadian troops, Waffen-SS divisions were among the first German units thrown into the fight. Some of them fought with ruthless determination, and some committed atrocities against prisoners and civilians as they had in the East. The SS carried its worldview with it even into defeat. Their cruelty was not strategic, it was identity. In their minds, the war was still a racial struggle, and any enemy could be treated as subhuman if it served the myth of SS superiority. But the Normandy campaign exposed something the SS hated to admit. The enemy in the West fought with a different kind of strength. Allied air power dominated the sky. Supplies arrived endlessly. German defenses collapsed in weeks. The SS fought hard around Caen, Falaise, and in the hedgerows of France. But they did not slow the tide. The retreat from Normandy was a collapse. Whole units were destroyed. The SS left roads littered with burned vehicles and bodies. It was not the disciplined withdrawal of a victorious force. It was the desperate escape of a losing one. Inside Germany, the home front was unraveling. The SS had long tried to rule through fear and surveillance, but fear has limits. As cities burned under bombing raids, basic trust in the regime began to fracture. People still whispered, still hid their doubts. But the mood was shifting from belief to exhaustion. The SS responded to this shift with predictable violence. The Gestapo expanded arrests for defeatism. Executions intensified. Informant networks were tightened. Himmler and the SS ran Germany like a prison whose walls were crumbling. The guards shouted louder, not because they were stronger, but because they were terrified of what would happen when the prisoners saw the doors opening. And in this year, the SS reached its most desperate expression in the camps. By 1944, the final solution had already killed millions, but the SS did not stop. Instead, it broadened and accelerated. The most chilling example came in Hungary. After Germany occupied the country in March, Adolf Eichmann and SS deportation units moved in with brutal efficiency. In just a few months, roughly 400,000 Hungarian Jews were deported, most to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The SS coordinated trains, selections, and gassing on a scale that even Auschwitz struggled to absorb. The crematoria could not keep up. Open-air burning pits were used again. The smoke thickened. The rhythm of death became frantic. Why did the SS push extermination so hard in 1944 when Germany was clearly losing? Because in SS ideology, genocide was not conditional on victory. It was victory. Completing annihilation was the one achievement Himmler thought could not be taken away. If the Reich fell, at least the racial mission would be fulfilled in its purest form. That delusion that destruction could stand in for success drove SS policy to the very end. But as the fronts collapsed, the camps came under threat. The Red Army was advancing toward Poland. The SS knew that if camps were captured intact, the world would see everything. So they began evacuations. These evacuations were not mercy. They were concealment and control. Prisoners were forced onto death marches westward in freezing weather, with little food or water. Those who collapsed were shot. Columns of starving people stumbled along roads as SS guards shouted orders and fired rifles. These marches killed tens of thousands. They also revealed how far SS discipline had decayed. The system that once killed with bureaucratic routine was now killing with raw desperation. The prisoners became moving evidence, and the SS was determined to keep that evidence from falling into enemy hands. At the same time, Himmler's SS empire was beginning to split internally. The traditional German military was furious at SS interference and political fanaticism. Some army officers plotted against Hitler, believing the war had become suicidal. This tension came to a head on July 20, when a group of officers attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb. The plot failed, and the SS, already suspicious of the army, unleashed a wave of vengeance. Himmler took control of the investigation. The Gestapo hunted conspirators and anyone even loosely connected to them. People were arrested not only for participation but for association, for rumors, for conversations overheard. Torture extracted confessions. Trials were staged as humiliations. Executions were carried out with theatrical bitterness. The SS used the July plot as proof that only it could protect the Reich from betrayal. In reality, it was proof that fear was rotting the regime from inside. When a state begins to hunt its own pillars, collapse is no longer a possibility. It is a process already underway. On the battlefields, the SS showed the same pattern. tightening violence as reality loosened. In the East, SS units participated in scorched earth retreats. Villages were burned. Civilians were executed as partisans simply because they were in the way. In the West, SS formations carried out massacres like the killings at Oradour-sur-Glane in France and Malmedy in Belgium. These were not isolated eruptions. They were the logic of SS identity collapsing into panic. The SS had been taught that mercy was weakness and that enemies were contamination. In retreat, that teaching became an excuse to kill more, not less. A wounded predator is often more dangerous than a confident one. Himmler, watching the empire shrink, spiraled further into fantasy. He continued to speak of destiny and sacrifice. He issued directives demanding total resistance. He spoke of new miracle weapons and of holding out until enemies collapsed. Yet behind his speeches was an unmistakable desperation. The SS leader who once mapped a 1,000-year empire now stared at maps where red arrows pointed straight toward Berlin. The bureaucracy that once functioned with surgical precision began to stumble. Reports arrived late. Factories lay in ruins. Rail lines were broken. The system that worshipped order was drowning in disorder. And still, for many SS men, obedience remained reflex. They had spent years surrendering conscience to command. Even as the world turned against them, their instinct was to continue. Some fought on in the East with fanatical fury. Some guarded camps and marched prisoners into death. Some signed papers and burned files. The SS had trained itself to function without moral reflection. That training did not evaporate in defeat. It simply became more brutal, because brutality was the only language the order knew. Yet in 1944, you begin to see the SS becoming not only cruel, but frightened. Fear crept into policy decisions. Evidence was destroyed. Archives were burned. Mass graves were dug up. Prisoners who might testify were shot. SS officers began to falsify records, hide identities, prepare escape plans. The order that once believed itself eternal was now planning how to survive its own collapse. This is one of history's sharpest ironies. The SS, which had demanded absolute loyalty from others, began to abandon loyalty itself when survival was at stake. By late 1944, Germany's defeat was no longer a distant shadow. It was a daily fact. The front in the East was within striking distance of the Reich. In the West, Allied armies pushed toward the German border. The SS, in response, tried one last gamble, the Ardennes offensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge. Waffen-SS units were among the spearheads. They attacked with fury, hoping to split Allied lines and force a negotiated peace. For a moment, they gained ground, but the offensive collapsed under Allied air power, fuel shortages, and overwhelming resistance. The SS had poured its last reserves into a dream of reversal, and the dream died in the snow. As the year ended, the SS stood at the edge of ruin. Its empire still killed, but it could no longer build. Its soldiers still fought, but they were fighting for a world that was vanishing under their feet. Its leaders still spoke of destiny, but destiny had turned away. The order that once grew through myth and discipline was now shrinking through panic and rage. 1944 was not the year the SS fell that would come in 1945, but it was the year the SS revealed the truth of what it had always been. At its core, it was not an institution of strength, it was an institution of fear. Fear of impurity, fear of weakness, fear of disobedience, fear of the human soul, when it becomes free to question. In 1944, that fear was no longer hidden behind black uniforms and polished rituals. It stood naked in the smoke of ruined cities, the frost of death marches, the frantic burning of files, and the desperate violence of retreat. The SS empire was collapsing outward and inward at the same time. It would not go quietly. Orders built on fanaticism rarely do. But the next year would force the SS to confront something it had never prepared for, the moment when obedience can no longer save you, and the world finally demands an accounting. The end of the Black Order. 1945. By the opening months of 1945, the SS was no longer an empire reaching outward. It was an empire folding in on itself. The Reich, that had promised 1,000 years, was reduced to a few desperate seasons. Germany's cities were broken, its roads clogged with refugees, its armies shattered into fragments. The SS, once the proud engine of conquest and extermination, now found itself trapped inside the ruins it had helped create. It still possessed weapons, uniforms, and command structures, but the spirit that had driven its rise was collapsing. Faith had curdled into panic. Discipline had frayed into survival. The order built to control history now faced the one thing it had never trained for: the moment when history stops obeying. In the East, Soviet forces pressed relentlessly toward the German heartland. The Red Army had crossed the Vistula and the Oder. It no longer fought for territory alone. It fought with the fury of a nation that had seen what SS conquest meant. Cities like Königsberg, Danzig, and Breslau became battlefields of annihilation. Waffen-SS units were thrown into defensive lines that broke again and again. They fought with desperation, not because they believed victory was possible, but because they dreaded what capture would bring. For many SS men, surrender to the Soviets meant death either in battle or after it. In that fear, they found their final fuel. The last SS defenses in the East were not built on destiny. They were built on terror. In the West, Allied armies crossed the Rhine and rolled into Germany itself. The SS tried to resist, but now it was a shell of its former precision. Supply lines were broken. Fuel was scarce. Morale had shattered. The Waffen-SS still produced fierce pockets of resistance, but they could no longer shape the war. They were being pushed backward by forces too large and too organized to stop. In place after place, SS units withdrew into the collapsing Reich, leaving behind burned bridges, destroyed towns, and the bitter residue of their ideology. They retreated not toward victory, but toward the center of a dying myth. Inside Germany, the SS became harsher even as its grip weakened. Himmler's police empire tightened its surveillance, its arrests, its executions. As defeat became undeniable, fear of betrayal spread like fever through the Nazi leadership. The Poseidon, Gestapo hunted deserters, defeatists, and anyone suspected of disloyalty. Men were hanged in public squares, under placards labeling them traitors. The SS tried to force obedience out of a country already exhausted beyond obedience. It was like watching a crumbling dam hold back a river with louder orders. The louder it shouted, the more clearly everyone could hear the crack beneath it. But no theater of SS collapse was as haunting as the camps. By early 1945, camps across Poland and the Reich's borders were in chaos. Soviet advances threatened Auschwitz, Majdanek, and countless smaller sites. The SS response followed the logic of concealment and cruelty it had already begun. In 1944, evacuate the prisoners, destroy the evidence, leave no witnesses alive to speak. The camps that could still be moved were emptied in freezing marches. Columns of skeletal people staggered westward, under SS guard, through snow and ruined villages. Every mile was a death sentence for those too weak to continue. The SS shot the fallen as they lay in ditches. These marches were not military necessity. They were ideological panic. If the camps were captured intact, the SS's crimes would be seen, without distortion, and the SS could not bear the world's gaze. Auschwitz was evacuated in January. Prisoners were driven out under gunpoint in temperatures below freezing, toward camps deeper inside Germany. What remained behind was a landscape of ash and unutterable silence. When Soviet troops arrived, they found warehouses full of confiscated shoes, hair, glasses, and children's toys, evidence that spoke even when people could not. The SS had burned much, but not enough. The empire of record-keeping could not entirely destroy its own memory. As Allied armies advanced through Germany, they encountered other camps: Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Mauthausen. Each discovery was a moment of stunned horror. Soldiers found bodies stacked like cordwood, survivors barely alive, the stench of starvation and disease clinging to air itself. The SS guards often fled before liberation, leaving behind the ruins of their system. Their uniforms were discarded in forests or buried in mud, as if cloth could erase guilt. But those crimes were already carved into history. Liberation turned SS secrecy into global revelation. The SS was disintegrating on every level: military, administrative, moral, psychological. Yet within the SS, there were still men who clung desperately to the old creed. They repeated oaths in bunkers, issued orders to units that no longer existed, and spoke of final resistance as if language itself could keep the Reich alive. This is the strange final stage of fanaticism, when belief becomes detached not only from morality, but from reality. The SS had always punished doubt. By 1945, the only way to survive mentally was either to cling to fantasy or to abandon it entirely. Many chose fantasy until the very last hour. In Berlin, that last hour came quickly. The capital had become a fortress of wreckage. Streets were cratered, buildings burned. Refugees and soldiers were crowded into basements. The sound of Soviet artillery grew closer each day, rumbling like a dark tide. Hitler had withdrawn into his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Around him were a shrinking circle of loyalists, including SS officers assigned to his protection. These men, once symbols of order, now stood in a city that had become pure disorder. The contrast was cruelly poetic. An order built to control Europe was now reduced to guarding a dictator in a hole beneath a collapsing capital. As April turned to May, the defenses of Berlin fell piece by piece. Waffen-SS units fought fiercely in the streets, often to the last man. Some did so out of remaining fanaticism, others because surrender seemed unthinkable. Many young recruits, barely trained, were thrown into a battle that no longer had strategic meaning. The SS demanded sacrifice, even when sacrifice could no longer serve a purpose. In a way, Berlin became the final ritual of the SS, the last ceremony of obedience carried out amid rubble instead of torchlight. Hitler killed himself on April 30. With him died the central anchor of SS loyalty. The oath the SS had sworn was to him personally. Without him, the order had no sacred center. Yet even then, some SS leaders tried to salvage the myth. Himmler, the architect of the SS empire, had already begun searching for escape. For years he had preached loyalty as a moral absolute, but now loyalty meant extinction. So he betrayed the very faith he had demanded from others. In secret, he attempted to negotiate surrender with the Western Allies, hoping to preserve some part of himself, perhaps even some part of his order. The attempt failed. The Allies refused to deal with him. Their refusal mattered not only politically, but morally. It was the world saying, "The SS system cannot be bargained with. It must be judged." Himmler fled, disguised as an ordinary soldier. This disguise was almost tragic in its symbolism. The man who had built an elite priesthood now tried to vanish into the mass of the defeated. He shaved his mustache, used false papers, and wandered through a disintegrating Germany that no longer recognized his authority. In May, British troops captured him. He was searched. His identity was confirmed, and before he could be tried, he bit down on a cyanide capsule and died. Himmler's suicide did not erase his guilt. It confirmed it. He died the way many SS leaders died, not as martyrs, but as men who could not face the meaning of what they had done. The SS had promised its members that loyalty was strength. Their leader's last act proved the opposite. His death was not devotion. It was escape. The SS, by late May, had ceased to exist as an institution. Its divisions surrendered or were destroyed. Its administrative offices were seized. Its records were captured. Its symbols banned. The black uniforms that once commanded fear were now proof of criminality. The Allies declared the SS a criminal organization, and with that declaration, the myth of sacred service was shattered in law. Those who had once worn the lightning runes now faced interrogation, imprisonment, or trial. But the destruction of the SS posed a deeper question. How did so many ordinary men, clerks, farmers, students, and soldiers become the machinery of organized evil? In the months after Germany's surrender, as investigators began opening SS files, the scale of the system became clearer. It had not been chaos. It had been order. It had not been a few monsters. It had been tens of thousands of functionaries, each performing tasks that seemed small in isolation, but catastrophic in combination. The SS machine had been built step by step, oath by oath, job by job, and that was what made it so terrifying. It was not an accident of history. It was a choice repeated until it became routine. For many SS men captured in 1945, their first defense was the one that had already been rehearsed in their minds. I only followed orders. The phrase spread through interrogations like a reflex. It became the moral shield of a generation. Yet the world's discovery of the camps made that shield thinner than paper. The evidence was too vast, the victims too real. The SS had recorded its own crimes so meticulously that denial collapsed under its own weight. The very bureaucratic passion for documentation that had sustained SS power now provided the map for its condemnation. For survivors, the end of the SS was not a clean turning of the page. Liberation came with bodies too weak to rejoice fully, with families erased, with homes destroyed. The SS empire fell in days, but its consequences would live for lifetimes. People emerged from camps into a world that no longer made sense. They carried names that had been turned into numbers, memories that could not be folded away. Their survival was proof that the SS had failed in its ultimate goal of erasing humanity. Yet survival also meant living with the knowledge of what the SS had done. By the end of 1945, the SS was a ruin, but not a forgotten one. Its leaders were dead or imprisoned, its symbols outlawed, its ranks scattered. Yet the shadow remained in the shattered towns of Poland, the burned villages of Ukraine, the empty streets of Jewish life across Europe, the still smoking remnants of camps. The SS did not simply fall like an army defeated in battle. It fell like a moral universe collapsing. It left behind a warning written not only in history books, but in silence, ashes, and memory. In the final hours of the war, the SS had revealed what it truly was. Not a path to order, but a pathway to annihilation. Not a sacred brotherhood, but an institution that demanded conscience be surrendered in exchange for belonging. It had begun in 1925 as a handful of bodyguards. It ended in 1945 as the most explicit proof of what happens when loyalty becomes more important than humanity. And in that ending, there was one quiet truth that history would not let go. The SS was defeated militarily, yes, but its deepest defeat was moral. The black uniform did not collapse because it was weak. It collapsed because it was wrong. The empire built on obedience found that obedience could not protect it from the judgment of a world finally awake. The order that had tried to make itself eternal lasted only 20 years, and in those 20 years it proved something terrible and necessary, that discipline without conscience is not strength. It is a road to ruin. As the smoke over Europe thinned, the SS had vanished into the wreckage, but its echo remained. The next chapter will follow that echo into the courts and memories of the post-war world, where justice tried to catch up to what history had already seen. Judgment, escape, and the long shadow, 1945, 1960. When the Reich collapsed, the SS did not simply disappear. It scattered. Like shards of black glass thrown across a continent, its men broke into fragments, some captured in uniform, some buried under rubble, some already moving through forests and borderlands under false names. The war had ended, but the SS story did not end with surrender. It shifted from battlefield to courtroom, from empire to exile, from command to concealment. The world now faced a second task, as complex as defeating Germany itself, deciding what justice meant after a crime so vast that even language strained to describe it. The first shock was discovery. Allied soldiers liberated camps and stumbled into horrors that had been hidden behind wire and euphemism. The SS's obsession with secrecy collapsed overnight. The world saw starvation, mass graves, warehouses packed with shoes and hair, survivors walking like ghosts through a landscape of ash. In those early months of 1945, photographs circulated across newspapers and military reports. Many people could not believe what they were seeing. Some refused to believe. But denial became impossible when the SS's own paperwork was found still stacked in offices and camp headquarters. Ledgers recorded transports, orders detailed special treatment, plans measured capacity as if human lives were industrial units. The SS had documented its crimes so thoroughly that evidence survived even when buildings did not. From this evidence rose the Nuremberg trials. In November 1945, in a city still bomb-scarred, the Allies began a legal reckoning without precedent. The courtroom was cold, formal, almost ordinary. Yet inside, it sat the architects of a system that had murdered millions. SS officers, along with other Nazi officials, watched as their own decrees, memos, and reports were read aloud. The trial did something radical for its time. It treated atrocity not as rumor or propaganda, but as a matter of law, proven through documents and testimony. For the SS, the verdict was definitive. The organization was declared criminal, not merely certain leaders, but the institution itself. That mattered because the SS had always claimed sacred legitimacy. It had called itself a racial priesthood, a knightly order, the moral heart of the Reich. Nuremberg stripped that illusion away in the language of justice. It said, in effect, the SS was not a shield of order. It was a machine of crime, but trials alone could not contain the problem. The SS was vast. Millions had served in its branches. Waffen-SS divisions, Gestapo officers, camp guards, administrators, intelligence agents. Some were high-ranking ideologues. Many were middle-level functionaries. Others were low-level participants who carried orders into action without ever seeing the full structure. How do you prosecute an empire made of paperwork and obedience? Nuremberg tried the top, but the shadow of the SS extended far beyond the men in that courtroom. Across Germany and Europe, smaller trials followed. Commandants, Gestapo chiefs, police officials, camp doctors, and guards were pursued. Some were convicted and executed. Others were imprisoned. Yet, even as justice began, the SS was already slipping through the cracks of chaos, because surrender had produced a vacuum. Europe was a sea of displaced people, refugees, soldiers, survivors, orphaned children, fleeing deserters. In that human flood, SS men could hide if they were clever, ruthless, or lucky. Many stripped off uniforms and blended into the crowds. They carried forged identity papers. They shaved mustaches, changed hair, practiced new names. Some managed to pass themselves off as ordinary soldiers or laborers. In towns where everyone was hungry and exhausted, few asked too many questions. Soon, escape routes formed what history later called the rat lines. These were not single highways but networks, paths through Austria and Italy, supported by a mix of former Nazi sympathizers, black market dealers, corrupt officials, and controversially certain clergy who believed they were helping anti-communist refugees. Papers were produced. Money changed hands. Ships were booked. Former SS officers slid out of Europe under new identities. Some reached Spain. Some reached the Middle East. Many reached South America. Argentina, especially under Juan Perón, became one of the most notorious refuges. The policy was presented as humanitarian, but it was also practical. These men brought money, technical skill, and anti-Soviet credentials. In Buenos Aires, Cordoba, and Patagonia, German-speaking communities grew. Some SS fugitives lived as mechanics, farmers, engineers. Others advised governments, helped build intelligence services, or quietly joined new authoritarian regimes. Distance from Europe was more than geography. It was moral oxygen enough to pretend the past had burned away. Yet justice followed. Survivors, journalists, and investigators refused to let the trail die. One of the most persistent was Simon Wiesenthal, a survivor himself, who dedicated his life to tracking Nazi criminals. He worked from cramped offices filled with photographs and files, chasing whispers across borders. For him, justice was not revenge. It was memory turned into action. Each SS man found was a fragment of history pulled back into the light. But the hunt faced a second force that complicated everything: the Cold War. By 1947, the world was dividing again, this time between Soviet and Western blocs. Anti-communism became a crease, new priority. And in that shifting landscape, some SS officers gained a second life, not in exile, but in service. Intelligence agencies in the West and East alike began valuing former SS men for their experience in espionage, counterinsurgency, and Eastern European networks. Files that had once marked them for prosecution were reclassified. Some men were quietly recruited, protected, or simply ignored. This was not a conspiracy in the simple movie sense. It was bureaucracy doing what bureaucracy does, choosing usefulness over morality. The same cold logic that once facilitated SS crimes now appeared in post-war politics. A man who had helped build a terror system could become an asset if he knew something about Soviet operations. The world that had sworn never again discovered how easily the future can tempt people to loosen their grip on the past. This political fog meant that for many SS fugitives, time became their greatest ally. Each year that passed made witnesses fewer, evidence harder to trace, public interest weaker. Many perpetrators lived into middle age or old age without facing trial. Others were caught late, their prosecution serving more as a lesson for memory than a punishment that could truly fit the crime. Yet even as justice faltered, the moral meaning of the SS did not fade. It deepened. Because survivors carried the SS story beyond courtrooms. They testified, wrote, spoke, and remembered. Their voices were not unified by ideology, but by loss. For years, many found the world unwilling to listen. Europe wanted to rebuild. Germany wanted to forget. Countries on both sides of the Cold War wanted stability more than uncomfortable truths. But memory has its own gravity. It pulls the world back to what it tried to bury. By the 1,950 seconds, quiet cracks in silence began to widen. Books appeared. Documents were published. Children born after the war started asking questions their parents avoided. In Israel, memory was central to national identity, and the hunt for Nazis was not merely legal, but moral. Across Europe, the early seeds of Holocaust education emerged, still fragile but persistent. The SS had tried to erase humanity. Now humanity insisted on naming what had happened. This period, the 15 years after 1945, was not the final chapter of the SS story, but it was its hinge. It was the transition from living terror to historical reckoning. The SS no longer ruled streets or camps, but its legacy haunted governments, families, and the very idea of modern morality. The world struggled to understand a truth that was as simple as it was unbearable. The SS had not been a monster fallen from the sky. It had been built by people who learned to obey, to classify, to kill, to pretend their tasks were ordinary. And that's why the shadow stretched so long. Because the question was no longer only, where did SS men go? It was, how did they happen? How did a society teach itself to worship obedience? How did careers become murder? How did paperwork become a weapon? These were questions courts could not fully answer. They required something slower, more human, and more enduring: remembrance. By 1960, much of the SS had vanished into three fates. Some were dead, some were imprisoned, some were hidden behind quiet lives, protected by distance, politics, or forgetting. But none were truly free of the past. Even in exile, fear of discovery lingered. An old photograph might surface, a witness might recognize a face, an investigator might knock on a door years after it should have closed. The SS had once promised its men immortality through service. In the end, the immortality they received was the opposite of what they imagined. They became eternal as a warning. Their lightning runes and black uniforms did not survive as symbols of power, but as symbols of what happens when belief is unchained from conscience and loyalty becomes a substitute for morality. The war was over. The SS empire was ashes. But the story was still moving toward the moment when the world would be forced, in one dramatic trial, to look directly at the machinery of genocide and the banality of its architects. That moment arrived in the next chapter: memory, renewal, and the warning that never ends. 1960. Today. In the decades after the war, the SS did not survive as an organization. Its ranks were broken, its insignia outlawed, its leaders dead or imprisoned. Yet history has a strange way of keeping certain shadows alive. Some empires endure through borders and armies. The SS endured through memory and through the uneasy truth that what it represented was not a freak accident of another century, but a human pattern that can return whenever conscience is allowed to sleep. By 1960, the world had rebuilt much of what the war had destroyed. Cities rose again from rubble. People married, had children, planted gardens where bomb craters had been. Life resumed its rhythm. But beneath that rhythm, something unfinished remained. A moral echo that refused to fade. Survivors lived with histories too heavy for ordinary conversation. Former perpetrators lived with secrets that they tried to bury. And nations lived with a question no treaty could answer: how should the world remember something that seemed beyond remembering? The turning point came not in a ruined European courtroom, but in the quiet streets of Buenos Aires. In May 1960, Israeli agents captured Adolf Eichmann, one of the key SS administrators of deportation. He had been living under a false identity, a modest man in a modest house, tucked into an ordinary neighborhood. The contrast was chilling. The architect of a machinery that moved millions to their deaths, now living as a man who might fix your fence or greet you politely at the gate. His capture alone was a statement. Time and oceans do not erase responsibility. When Eichmann was brought to Jerusalem for trial in 1961, the world watched as if holding its breath. The trials at Nuremberg had proven the SS criminal in law, but Eichmann's trial did something more intimate. It made the SS story public in a new way, carried not just by documents, but by voices, survivors speaking directly to millions through television and radio. In living rooms across the world, people heard testimony that had once been whispered only in private grief. Names of places: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, were no longer distant syllables in a history text. They became realities spoken in trembling human voices. Eichmann's defense was the same defense that had already begun to form in 1000 945. I was only following orders. Calmly, almost politely, he described himself as a bureaucrat who had simply done his duty. His tone horrified the world as much as his crimes did. It was the purest expression of what the SS had become evil, not as wild rage, but as procedural obedience. And that is why the trial changed history, not because it uncovered new facts, but because it revealed an old truth that modern society struggled to accept. The SS was not only a story about monsters, it was a story about ordinary people who surrendered their moral judgment to a system, and in doing so, became instruments of unprecedented destruction. Eichmann was found guilty and executed in 1962, but his death did not close the book. It opened the public conscience. In the years that followed, smaller trials across Germany and Europe continued. Camp guards, doctors, police officers, and administrators were prosecuted. Some were convicted, some were acquitted, many were never found. Yet the broader consequence was clear. The age of silence was cracking. In Germany, this crack widened slowly. The first, post-war generation had mostly avoided the SS story. Rebuilding the country felt more urgent than revisiting its guilt. Teachers often skipped quickly past the camps. Families stayed quiet. Streets were renamed, not because the past was forgotten, but because it was too painful to name aloud. But children born after the war would not accept endless silence. In the late 1960s and 70s, a younger generation began asking the questions their parents feared. What did you do during the war? What did you know? Who were we, really? Universities became battlegrounds for memory. Students demanded truth. Historians pushed archives open. Filmmakers and writers began telling stories not only of SS crimes, but of the social machinery that had made those crimes possible. This generational awakening transformed remembrance from a private burden into a civic duty. The SS story became one of the central moral lessons of modern Europe. In classrooms, in documentaries, in museum halls, the black uniforms returned not as symbols to admire, but as symbols to understand and reject. The moral language of never again began to mean something real. Across Europe, memorials rose. Where SS power once ruled, former camps became museums. Guard towers and barracks were preserved, not because anyone wanted to keep them, but because the world needed evidence it could walk through. Visitors stood in quiet corridors where people had once been reduced to numbers. They looked at piles of shoes, hair, and children's belongings behind glass, ordinary objects that became unbearable proof. Memory was no longer just a story. It became a place. In Poland, Auschwitz remained the most haunting emblem. Its iron gate still stood, the tracks still cut through the ground. The silence there was not empty. It was crowded with what could not be restored. Everywhere in Europe, similar places became sanctuaries of warning. History was no longer only written in books, it was carved into landscapes, and survivors became caretakers of this memory. Many survivors spent decades speaking in schools, giving interviews, recording testimonies. For them, remembrance was a second fight, not against SS men with rifles, but against time, denial, and forgetting. Their voices were often quiet, aging, sometimes shaking, but each belonged to a truth that could not be allowed to fade. These testimonies were filmed, translated, digitized. The world built archives so that even when survivors were gone, their words would remain. Memory began to organize itself into rituals, annual days of commemoration, moments of silence, public readings of victim names. These practices did not undo what the SS had done. Nothing could. But they gave the world a moral map, a way to say, we see, we remember, we will not allow this to be buried. Yet memory is never secure. It must be defended. As the 20th century closed and the 21st began, a new danger emerged: myth without memory. The further society moved from the war, the easier it became for some people to flatten the SS story into caricature, or worse, to romanticize its symbols. Here the threat was not uniformed armies marching through streets. It was something quieter and more scattered. Denial, distortion, and ideological revival. The internet gave old ghosts new pathways. SS symbols, the black sun, the runes, the lightning bolts began appearing in fringe communities. Sometimes they were presented as history, sometimes as rebellion, sometimes wrapped in irony so thin it could dissolve at a touch. Extremist movements borrowed SS language about strength and purity, reshaping it for modern grievances. Conspiracy theories echoed old propaganda. Hate adapted itself to digital speed. This was not the return of the SS as an institution. It was the return of the logic that had fed it. The promise of belonging through exclusion, the illusion of purity through violence, the seduction of certainty over thought. The SS had always relied on myth. In the modern world, myth gained new engines, algorithms, closed groups, viral slogans. Educators, historians, and activists responded. Museums built digital archives. Survivors' testimonies were indexed for anyone to watch. Virtual tours of camps were created for students who could not travel. Documentaries streamed worldwide. The battle for memory moved onto the same screens where distortion spread. The work of remembrance became a form of resistance. At the same time, there was another transformation. Memory became personal again. In Europe, grandchildren began opening attics and drawers where their families had hidden letters, medals, and photographs. Some found ancestors among victims. Some found them among perpetrators. Many found them among the silent middle, those who complied, benefited, or looked away. These discoveries sparked memoirs, documentaries, and public conversations. Families confronted the painful realization that SS history was not only national, it was intimate. The past was no longer an abstract warning. It was a face that resembled their own. Psychologists began to study this generational echo. Trauma and guilt had passed through bloodlines like quiet inheritance. The children and grandchildren of SS men often carried anxiety, shame, or restlessness without fully knowing why. Silence was its own kind of transmission. Confronting the past did not erase pain, but it gave it meaning. Through this confrontation, remembrance deepened into something more honest than catastrophe recounted from a distance. It became humanity reckoning with itself in a mirror, and that mirror is what the SS ultimately left behind. The SS had believed it was building a perfect order. Instead, it built the most precise demonstration of how order can become lethal when it is detached from conscience. Its system was admired by its members because it felt clean, disciplined, purposeful, but purpose without mercy becomes domination. Discipline without moral judgment becomes machinery. Loyalty without limits becomes a weapon. This is why the SS story refuses to settle quietly into the past. It is not only about what happened, it is about how it happened and how similar patterns begin, not with shouting crowds at first, but with small recalibrations of conscience, with people choosing belonging over empathy, with institutions rewarding obedience more than thought, with language that makes cruelty sound like policy. Every era believes it is immune to such drift, until it is not. So, remembrance is not a museum activity. It is a living obligation. When we teach the SS story today, we do not do it to keep hatred alive. We do it to keep awareness alive. We do it to remind ourselves that the line between civilization and catastrophe is thinner than pride wants to admit. That ordinary people can become instruments of horror when systems demand silence and society treats doubt as disloyalty. The SS did not rise by magic. It rose because humans built it, piece by piece, while telling themselves they were serving something noble. That is the warning carved into history. If You stand today in the ruins of an SS barrack or a camp gate. You don't feel triumph. You feel stillness. The air is quiet, but not empty. It's full of breath that was stolen, of lives that were cut away from the world. The stones do not accuse. They ask. They ask whether we recognize the early language of hatred when it looks polite, whether we see how swiftly duty can become a mask for cruelty, whether we understand that freedom is not the absence of authority, but the presence of conscience. The SS was dismantled in 1945. Its crimes were judged in courts. Its symbols were banned. But the lesson of the SS is not secured by law alone. It rests in memory, in education, in vigilance, because evil, as the SS proved, does not always return with a roar. Sometimes it returns as a whisper that sounds like certainty. Tonight, as we close this long journey through the rise and fall of the SS, what remains is not only sorrow, but clarity. The SS tried to build eternity through domination. Instead, it became a permanent warning against domination itself. It showed the world what obedience becomes when it forgets compassion. It showed how quickly ideology can turn neighbors into targets. It showed that the most dangerous systems are not those built on chaos, but those built on order without soul. And so the story ends where it must always end, in the present, in the quiet lives we live now, in the choices we make when we see prejudice forming, when we hear language hardening, when we feel the pull of belonging that demands someone else be excluded. The past does not ask us for guilt, it asks us for awareness. This is Lullaby of Empires. And if this story has done anything tonight, let it be this: not to keep you awake in fear, but to keep your conscience awake in peace. The SS is gone, but its echo is a lesson the world must never allow itself to forget.